She sat at the head of the longest table in the empire, pearls at her throat, crown steady, hands folded like she'd been carved from marble. The king's bastard child was growing in a servant girl's belly. Every noble in that hall was watching Seraphina's face, waiting for the crack, waiting for the screaming, the weeping, the collapse of a woman finally beaten. They'd been waiting her whole life for that moment. They were still waiting. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. And don't you dare leave before you see what she does next. Like the video, you'll want to come back for this one. The banquet had been Darius's idea. 3 weeks after the Eastern campaign closed, after the last of the Vale border lords bent the knee and the supply route stopped bleeding soldiers into the mud, he'd ordered the palace kitchens to open everything, every cellar, every smokehouse, a feast worthy of an empire that had finally stopped hemorrhaging itself dry. Queen Seraphina had sat across from the planning ministers and said nothing when they laid the guest list in front of her. 64 nobles, 11 foreign dignitaries, 200 palace staff cycling through the hall in shifts. She had approved it the way she approved most things Darius put before her, with a signature and a silence that he never learned to read correctly. The hall itself was a spectacle. Torchlight from 40 iron brackets threw orange across the limestone columns, and the smell of roasted boar and spiced wine had been soaking into the tapestries since mid-afternoon. Long tables ran parallel down the length of the floor. The high table at the north end raised 3 steps above everything else, so that anyone who sat there could see the full length of the room without trying. Seraphina had always hated that elevation. She'd said so once, early in the marriage, told Darius it felt like sitting in a hunting blind waiting to watch something die. He'd laughed and told her she was being poetic. She hadn't been being poetic. She took her seat at his left that evening in a dress the color of cold ash. Not silver, not white, something in between that the candlelight couldn't decide on. Her hair was pinned with no ornament except the thin band of her crown, which she wore flat and straight, the way she'd worn it since her coronation day, the way her mother had worn her own before the fever took her. The court's seamstresses had wanted something warmer for a celebration feast. More gold. More color. Seraphina had declined without explanation. Darius arrived late. He always arrived late to his own events, a habit she'd stopped noting years ago. He came in from the side corridor with 2 of his personal guard flanking him and the smell of the stables still faint on his riding coat, which meant he'd been out on the eastern grounds again, despite the council meeting that had run until nearly dusk. He took his seat, reached for his goblet, and found her looking at him. "You look tired," she said. "Campaign fatigue," he said. "It takes time to come off." She turned back to the hall. He was not tired from the campaign. The campaign had been over 3 weeks, but she had learned a long time ago the difference between the lies worth pulling on and the ones that would cost more to unravel than to leave knotted. The feast opened with the formal toasts. Lord Commander Heron gave the first, a long, labored tribute to the king's eastern strategy that hit every expected note and earned the expected applause. Then the foreign envoy from the northern coast, a small dry man named Aldrich, who spoke imperial with an accent like gravel through a sieve, offered something brief and diplomatic that no one entirely understood. Seraphina watched the room as each toast landed, watched which faces went with the crowd, and which ones paused a half-second too late before raising their cups. She counted 3. Lord Fenwick at the second table, who had been one of Cedric Vale's men for 15 years and had never once bothered to hide it. Minister Galloway, whose estate sat on the eastern border and who had been quietly petitioning the crown for redistricted tax exemptions since before the campaign even launched. And the woman at the far end of the dignitaries' table, Lady Ruel, whose family name meant nothing to most of the court, but whose brother Seraphina had once tracked through 4 proxy accounts before finding his money in a Valian shipping operation that had no business moving that much undeclared iron. 3 faces, 3 half-second pauses. She drank her wine. The first hour of the feast passed the way. All imperial banquets passed, food arriving in waves, conversation filling the gaps between, the constant low-grade performance of people who needed to be seen enjoying themselves by other people who were equally unconvinced. Darius talked to the generals on his right. Seraphina talked to no one unless spoken to, and when she was spoken to, she answered with the precise economy that had earned her a reputation for coldness in every court that had ever tried to assess her. She wasn't cold. She was watching. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from watching a room full of people pretend. Not the exhaustion of labor or sleeplessness. She had known both. but something quieter and more persistent, the kind that settles behind the eyes and in the jaw from years of reading faces that are working very hard not to be read. Serafina had been doing this since she was 11 years old, and her father set her at the dinner table beside men who smiled too wide and laughed too loud, and were later found with correspondence they should not have had. He had not trained her formally. He had simply placed her there and said, afterward, "Tell me what you saw." And she had told him, every time. And every time she had been right. The girl came out of the kitchen corridor at the second hour. Serafina noticed her the way she noticed everything. Not as a focal point, but as a peripheral displacement, a rhythm break in the movement of the hall. The palace maids worked in flows, organized by the head steward into near-invisible rotations that kept every glass full and every plate cleared without drawing attention to the machinery behind it. This girl came out of sequence, too early for the next rotation, too far from the main service route, carrying a tray that held 2 pitchers and moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something they were trying not to show. She was young, not a child, 17, maybe 18, with dark hair pulled under a white linen cap and the kind of plain, unremarkable face that most people in that hall would look past without registering. She was slim, and under the loose fabric of the serving apron, there was something. Serafina's attention sharpened. The girl moved between the tables with practiced invisibility, filling cups, stepping back, redirecting around clusters of standing nobles, the way a fish moves around rocks in current, fluid, automatic, like she had mapped every obstacle in advance. But her right arm kept folding across her midsection when she turned. Not a reach, not an adjustment, a shield. Small and unconscious and repeated every time someone passed too close. Nobody else saw it. Serafina set down her goblet. She did not move. She did not call for anyone. She simply watched the girl work her way through the mid-hall rotation, watched the arm fold 3 more times, watched the slight labor in the breathing when she turned quickly, the extra half-second before she straightened after bending to clear a lower tray. The feast continued around her. Darius was laughing at something General Heron had said. The music from the gallery above filled the silence between conversations. Somewhere down the right table, a group of minor nobles were getting loud on the spiced wine, and one of the senior staff would have to step in within the next quarter hour. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. The girl set her tray on the service ledge near the eastern column and pressed her back against the stone for a moment, her eyes shut, her hand flat against her stomach. Not a shield this time, a steadying. Serafina rose from her chair, not with haste. She stood the way she always stood, straight, controlled, with the kind of quiet deliberateness that made people look without knowing why they were looking. She stepped down from the raised platform and moved into the hall, and the nearest nobles parted for her automatically, the way water parts around something that does not apologize for taking up space. She reached the eastern column before anyone understood what she was moving toward. The girl opened her eyes. For a single terrible moment, the two of them looked at each other. The queen of the Alpha Empire and a palace-serving maid with her hand pressed flat against a secret that had apparently been carried through every shift rotation for God knew how long. The girl's face went the color of old ash. Her mouth opened. Her body started to fold into a bow. "Don't," Serafina said. The word came out quiet. Not a command in the formal sense. No weight of title behind it. No edge of the anger the girl was clearly bracing for. Just a single syllable that stopped the bow before it completed. "Stand up straight," Serafina said. The girl stood. Her eyes were not entirely steady, but she held them up, which Serafina registered as something worth noting. "How far along are you?" A breath. A silence that stretched 2 full seconds. Around them, the nearest conversations had begun to hollow. The sound of a room's attention redirecting toward a single point. That particular quiet that moves through a crowd like a tide pulling back from shore before something larger comes in. "Your Majesty, I asked a question." The girl's jaw tightened. One hand dropped to her side. The other stayed at her stomach, and Serafina watched that hand. The deliberateness of it, the refusal, even now under the full weight of a royal interrogation, to move it away. "5 months," the girl said. "Who knows?" "Only the physician, Your Majesty, Master Aldrin. He found out last month. He told me to stop working the hall, and I told him I couldn't." "Why couldn't you?" Another silence. Longer. The girl's eyes moved past Serafina for just a moment, toward the high table, toward the raised seat, where King Darius Blackthorn was now sitting very still with his cup halfway to his mouth. Seraphina did not turn around. "Look at me," she said. "Not him. Me." The girl looked at her. "Why couldn't you stop working the hall?" "Because if I stopped," the girl said, and her voice came out unsteady at the edges, but she kept it going, "they would ask why. And if they asked why, the ones who arranged it, they said if anyone found out before—" She stopped, swallowed. "They said they would make sure it was my fault, that I had gone to the king on purpose." "And had you?" "No." The word came out with more force than anything else she'd said. "No, Your Majesty. I was a fool, maybe. But I didn't go to him. I was told to serve the private dining chamber. I was given a reason. I didn't—" Her voice cracked on the last word and she pressed her mouth shut. "All right," Seraphina said. "It was not comfort. It was not dismissal. It landed like a door being carefully closed, final, deliberate, with the specific quality of a woman who had heard enough to know what she was dealing with." She turned then. The hall had gone almost entirely silent. 64 nobles, 11 foreign dignitaries, 200 staff. Every face turned toward the eastern column where the queen of the Alpha Empire stood 3 feet from a pregnant serving maid with 5 months of silence in her belly. At the high table, King Darius had set down his cup. His face was the particular shade of controlled expressionlessness that Seraphina recognized as fear he had not yet decided how to wear. General Heron had pushed back his chair. Lord Fenwick had gone very still. She walked back through the hall. The crowd parted again. Faster this time, people stepping away almost before they realized they were doing it, the way men step clear of a fire that hasn't yet reached its full height, but is already throwing heat. She climbed the 3 steps to the high table and stood at her seat without sitting down. The silence in the hall had become a physical thing. Master Aldrin. The royal physician materialized from somewhere near the gallery stairs. A compact, white-haired man in his late 60s with the permanently half-apologetic expression of someone who had spent 4 decades delivering news that other people did not want to receive. He stopped at the foot of the steps and bowed. "Your Majesty." "The girl by the eastern column. You've been seeing her?" A pause. "Yes, Your Majesty." "And the child she's carrying?" The physician's eyes moved briefly to the king, then back. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Whose is it?" The word fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Not a ripple, an obliteration of the surface. Aldrin had the complexion of a man who had hoped, perhaps irrationally, that he might somehow not be the one standing in this particular spot on this particular evening. His jaw worked once, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your Majesty, I'm not asking for a physician's interpretation," Seraphina said. "I'm asking you to confirm what this room already suspects. Whose child is the girl carrying?" The pause lasted long enough that Darius himself broke it. "Seraphina." His voice came from directly beside her. Low, private, the voice he used when he was trying to contain something that was already beyond containing. "This is not the place." "Then where?" She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. "Your council chamber? Another private dining room? The stables, perhaps, where you've spent the last 3 weeks working off campaign fatigue?" She felt him go rigid beside her. "Seraphina." "Master Aldrin." She looked at the physician and held his gaze with the steady, unhurried quality of a woman who intended to be answered. "I will not ask again." Aldrin's chin came up. Whatever he was, timid, compromised, afraid, he was also, at core, a physician who had sworn an oath to honest practice 30 years before he ever entered the palace. "The child belongs to the king," he said. "Your Majesty." The room did not make a sound. Not a chair scraped, not a cup touched a table. Not a single one of the 270-some people in that hall drew an audible breath. The silence was so complete it had its own weight, its own texture, the specific quality of a room holding itself together around a thing it cannot quite believe has just been spoken aloud. Darius's hand had closed on the back of his chair. Seraphina looked at him. She had been married to this man for 8 years. She had stood beside him in the Eastern campaigns when the supply lines broke and the men were eating bark soup and he'd refused to retreat. She had sat through every council meeting, drafted the political language for every treaty, identified every conspiracy against the throne before it grew roots. She had done all of this without title, without formal acknowledgement, without the court's understanding of what she actually contributed, because she had understood from the beginning that visible power is the power other people take away from you, and the power worth keeping is the kind nobody thinks to look for. She knew his face, every version of it. What she saw now was guilt that had been living behind his eyes for months and had finally run out of room to hide. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked out at the hall. "There is a pregnant woman standing against my eastern column," she said, and her voice carried the full length of the room without effort, the way certain voices do. Not from volume, but from something in the composition of them, a density of intention that fills a space more thoroughly than shouting. She has been standing at that column for the last hour, working a rotation that she should not be working, because someone told her that if she showed any sign of her condition, the fault would be placed entirely on her. The silence thinned differently now. Not the silence of shock, the silence of a room that was beginning to understand the shape of something larger than it had anticipated. "Someone in this hall," Serafina continued, "arranged for that woman to be placed in the king's private dining chamber, arranged for the circumstances that followed, and then allowed her to carry this secret for 5 months, alone, while working the palace floor, because it served their purpose to have her frightened and isolated and without protection." Her eyes moved through the hall, slowly, not the theatrical sweep of a performance, the actual, deliberate examination of a woman reading faces. Fenwick. Still. Galloway. Looking at the table. Ruel. Looking at Serafina with an expression caught somewhere between calculation and the dawning, horrified recognition that she had miscalculated something. "I am aware," Serafina said, "that many of you came here tonight expecting to witness something specific." She let that sit for a moment. "You expected to see a wife discover a public humiliation and respond with the kind of reaction that could be managed. Anger that could be named as instability. Grief that could be named as weakness. A scene that could be used as grounds to question my fitness for the throne." She paused. "I understand why you expected that. It is a reasonable expectation given how these situations usually conclude." The torch nearest the high table popped and threw a brief orange flare across the limestone. "So let me be specific," she said. Her voice did not change in register or volume. It simply clarified, the way a lens clarifies when rotated to its final position, and suddenly the blurred shape resolves into a point of devastating sharpness. "If anyone in this empire, noble, minister, guard, servant, or family, touches that woman or causes harm to the child she is carrying, I will not respond with grief. I will not respond with instability. I will not step down from this throne and give whoever arranged this the outcome they built it for." She looked at the hall. "I will burn this empire to the ground myself." It wasn't a threat in the conventional sense. There was no performance in it, no inflation, no rhetorical emphasis designed to make it sound larger than it was. It had the quality of something stated rather than declared, a fact being communicated. The same tone a general uses when informing a subordinate of the terrain they're about to cross, which was, in its way, infinitely more terrifying than a shout. For a moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, the room held itself in a kind of suspended disbelief, the way a body holds itself in the moment, between taking a bad fall and feeling the ground. Then Lord Heron dropped to one knee. He did it without ceremony, without any visible calculation. A man whose instincts for power had been honed over 40 years of military service, and who recognized in those words the specific gravity of an ultimatum that was not a bluff. His knee hit the stone floor with a sound that rang through the silence like a bell. And then the room came down, not all at once, not simultaneously, in a wave, starting from the closest tables and moving outward, nobles and ministers and guards and staff folding to their knees in succession, the sound of it rolling through the hall like timber falling in sequence, a cascade that took perhaps 15 seconds to reach the far end and leave the room as a single mass of bowed heads. 64 nobles, 11 foreign dignitaries, 200 palace staff, all of them on their knees. Serafina stood at the high table and looked at the space above their heads, at the torchlight moving in the gallery above, at the long shadows thrown by the iron brackets, at the smoke darkening the stone ceiling that had watched 3 generations of Blackthorn kings hold court in this room. Beside her, Darius had not moved. She did not look at him. "Bring the girl to my chambers," she said to the head steward, who was on his knees with the rest of them. "Get Master Aldrin to attend her tonight and every night until further notice. She is under the crown's protection from this moment." If anyone questions that order, they answer to me directly. Yes, Your Majesty, the steward said to the floor. The feast is over. She stepped down from the platform. The crowd did not rise. She walked through them, through the kneeling rows, through the bowed heads, and the averted eyes, and the particular quality of silence that follows a detonation before the ears have recovered enough to start processing the damage. She walked without haste, without triumph, without any of the things the room might have projected onto her as she went. She was not triumphant. She was already thinking about Cedric. Her uncle had not attended the feast. That was the thing that had been sitting at the back of her attention since the seating chart arrived that morning. Lord Cedric Vale, her mother's brother, the most powerful landed noble in the empire, had sent his regrets the previous afternoon through his steward, citing a health matter that required his presence at his estate. It was the third event he'd skipped in 6 weeks, each time with a different excuse, each time at an event where, looking back, something had gone slightly wrong. A miscommunication in the supply records, a minor diplomatic incident with the Northern Envoy's escort, a forgettable little procedural chaos that resolved itself quickly and left no visible fingerprints. She had noted the pattern. She had not yet decided what to do with it. She moved through the corridor behind the hall, up the side stair that bypassed the main residential wing, through the sequence of stone passages that led to the upper queen's rooms where she had chosen to sleep for the last 4 years. Not the queen's formal chambers adjoining the king's, but the private apartments 2 floors up, with windows facing east and walls thick enough that the court gossips had long given up trying to assess the marriage from the sleeping arrangements. Her maid Cressida was waiting at the door. One look at Seraphina's face, and she asked no questions, simply stepped aside and followed her in. The apartments were warm. The hearth had been laid and lit at dusk, and the sitting room held the particular tight warmth of a room that has been closed against the night air. Seraphina sat down in the chair closest to the fire. Not her reading chair, not the formal receiving seat by the window, but the low-backed one nearest the heat that she'd pulled from a disused servant's room 2 years ago, because it had the correct depth and the particular quality of plain, uncomfortable honesty she'd found useful for thinking in. Cressida poured water and brought it without being asked. Was it bad? Cressida said. No, Seraphina said. Cressida sat in the chair across from her. She was 43, had been Seraphina's personal maid since Seraphina was 14, and had no capacity for the professional deference that the court considered appropriate between a queen and her household staff. Seraphina had long stopped finding this remarkable and now simply found it necessary. The girls being brought up? Yes. And the king? Seraphina looked at the fire. He'll come eventually. Tonight? Tonight. Cressida was quiet. She was one of the few people in the palace who had the specific intelligence to recognize when Seraphina was not ready to speak about something, not closed to it, not refusing, but still sorting the pieces into a shape she could hold before she tried to put them into words for another person. The fire worked at the wood. Seraphina was thinking about Cedric Vale. She was thinking about the way the trap had been constructed, not its execution, which had been moderately competent, but its conception, which had required a particular kind of thinking. You don't arrange for a servant girl to be placed in the king's path, and then spend 5 months managing the silence around it without a significant investment of resources and leverage. That kind of sustained operation requires people inside the palace. Not just sympathizers, but placed agents, people whose daily proximity to the royal household gives them information and access that money alone cannot purchase. It requires patience. It requires someone who is willing to let a pregnant girl carry a secret for 5 months in physical labor, because the timing of its revelation matters more to them than her suffering. And it requires, above everything else, a clear exit strategy. The revelation at the feast was not a mistake or a miscalculation. Someone had chosen that evening deliberately, had arranged for it to surface in the most public possible setting, with the maximum number of witnesses, at a moment specifically designed to catch the queen in a position where her response would be on display to the entire imperial court. They had wanted her to break publicly. They had planned for the rage or the collapse, for the emotional response that could be characterized as instability, used as evidence, leveraged against her position. They had not planned for cold. That was their error. But the error only bought her time. Whoever had built this had not been building it for 5 months. This was architecture. This was the kind of work that takes years and requires someone with years to spend. someone embedded in the Empire's power structure at a level where the long game is the only game worth playing. Her uncle was 71 years old. He had been playing the long game since before she was born. A knock came at the door. Cressida answered it. The head steward's voice, low. The girl had arrived. Master Aldrin was with her. Both were waiting in the outer sitting room. Send the physician in, Seraphina said. Keep the girl comfortable. I'll see her shortly. Master Aldrin came in without his usual apologetic half-bow, which told her he had used the walk from the hall to reach some kind of internal resolution. He stood at the edge of the hearth light and looked at her directly, the way he had not quite managed downstairs. She's well enough, he said. Tired and shaken, but the child is healthy. I've been monitoring her weekly since I found out. Why didn't you come to me? She asked me not to. He paused. She said if it reached you before she was further along, the people who'd arranged it would move sooner and she'd have less time to... She wasn't sure for what exactly. I think she was hoping for a way out of the palace entirely. That's what they told her to hope for, Seraphina said. It kept her quiet and kept her isolated. If she'd run, they would have found her before she got 3 miles past the gate. Aldrin looked at her steadily. She's not a woman who deserves to be in this position. No, Seraphina said. She's not. What will you do with her? Keep her safe, Seraphina said, and find out exactly who placed her in that dining chamber and what they were promised for doing it. Aldrin nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped. Your Majesty. He didn't look back. What you said downstairs? The thing about burning the Empire. Yes. Did you mean it? She considered the question with the same seriousness she would give any question worth answering. I meant what it was designed to communicate, she said, which is that the cost of touching that woman is higher than anyone in that hall is prepared to pay. That's not quite the same thing as answering, Aldrin said. No, she agreed. It's not. He left. Cressida was watching her from across the room. The king, Cressida said. Seraphina heard the footsteps in the outer corridor before Cressida finished the sentence. Not running, not hurrying, but moving with the particular deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say and is holding it together by will. She knew the cadence of his steps as well as she knew her own. 8 years of proximity creates that kind of knowledge whether you want it or not. The knock was 3 times, measured, his knock. Come in. He looked, older than he had at the table. Not by much, not in a way the court would have registered, but she could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way he stopped inside the door rather than moving into the room, as if some part of him was uncertain about the territory. Darius Blackthorne was not a man who was often uncertain about territory. She had watched him walk into ambushes with more composure than he was bringing into her sitting room right now. She was already standing by the window when he came in, because she had known he would come and had known she would need the space between them to hear him without the proximity of the fire and the intimacy it implied. He looked at her. I should have told you, he said. Yes. I didn't. It wasn't. He stopped, pressed his jaw shut, started again. I didn't know until 2 months ago. About the girl. I didn't know she was in the palace still. I thought, what did you think? I thought it had been handled. Someone told me it had been handled, that she'd been relocated, given a settlement, that... He made a short, frustrated gesture that she recognized as the particular form of his anger that was directed entirely inward. I was told a lie. You were told several lies, she said, for several months, possibly longer. She looked at him. Who told you it had been handled? He went still. Who, Darius? I need to look into it before I... Who told you the girl had been relocated? The silence had a different quality than the silence in the hall. That one had been the silence of a crowd holding its breath. This one was the silence of 2 people in a room that had years of history in its walls, standing at a specific kind of crossroads that could only be arrived at through accumulated wrong turnings. He looked at her with the face she had memorized 8 years ago and had been rereading ever since. Cedric, he said. Seraphina felt it land, so. Not with surprise, because surprise was not what she had been building toward, but with the particular quality of confirmation that comes after a long, careful calculation finally resolves to its expected answer. The way a navigator feels when the coastline appears where the charts promised it would be. When, she said. 2 months ago, he came to me privately, said he'd handled the situation, said the girl had... He stopped again. The full weight of it was arriving. She could see it moving through him, the specific process of a man understanding, in sequence, the dimensions of how comprehensively he had been used. He said it was contained. Contained, she repeated. He let you believe he was protecting you while he kept the girl in the palace, pregnant, accessible, available to be revealed at exactly the moment of his choosing. She looked at Darius steadily. He needed your guilt as much as he needed the revelation. Guilty men don't investigate. Guilty men accept convenient explanations because accepting them costs less than asking for the truth. Darius looked at her for a long moment. You knew, he said. Not an accusation, something closer to awe, and not entirely comfortable awe. You knew it was him. I suspected it was him. Now I know. She turned back to the window. Outside, the palace grounds lay in the particular dark of a clear sky night, the torches at the gateposts throwing small orange circles in the blackness. He wasn't here tonight. He hasn't been at 3 consecutive events. Each time something small went wrong. Small enough to be explained, large enough to be useful as cover for whoever was doing his groundwork inside the palace. What are you going to do? She was quiet for a moment. The darkness outside the window held its shape. He'll move quickly now, she said. Tonight didn't go the way he planned, and he knows it. He'll recalculate. She turned back. What I need from you is complete and unambiguous public backing from this moment forward. No private conversations with Cedric. No back-channel communications through intermediaries. If he reaches out to you directly or otherwise, I need to know within the hour. Darius looked at her. You're asking me to help trap your own uncle. My uncle, she said, arranged for you to be used as a weapon against your own throne. He arranged for a girl barely old enough to be considered a woman to carry that weight for 5 months alone, so that the damage would land at the exact moment it would hurt the worst. She met his eyes. What I'm asking you is whether you intend to help me or whether you intend to be in his way. He held her gaze. I was a man who had ridden through enough battles to know what genuine danger looked like versus its performance. He was looking at genuine danger now, and the particular intelligence that had kept him alive through 3 campaigns was clear enough to recognize that the danger was not from her. It was from the situation she was describing, and the only reasonable response was the one she was asking him to give. Tell me what you need, he said. She nodded, not warmly, not coldly, simply. Start with the man who first told you the girl was being placed in the private dining chamber. I want his name, his position, and every point of contact he has with Cedric's household. Don't go through the regular council channels. Take it directly to Heron and no one else. All right. And Darius. He stopped at the door. The girl's name is Evelyn Hart. She's going to have your child in 4 months. I need you to know that, and I need you to hold it clearly, because what comes next is going to be complicated and she can't afford to become an abstraction in the middle of it. He was quiet for a moment. I know her name, he said. Good, Serafina said. Then go. He went. She stood at the window for a long time after the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor. The palace settled around her in its nighttime quiet, the reduced frequency creak of stone cooling after a warm day, the distant sound of the gate rotation, the wind coming off the eastern plain and working itself into the narrow gap between the window frame and the wall. Cedric Vale had spent, she was calculating now, not guessing, at minimum 18 months on this particular operation. The placement of Evelyn Hart in the palace, the cultivation of whatever internal agents he was running, the construction of a cover story reliable enough to keep Darius incurious, the careful management of timing to ensure the revelation landed at its maximum possible impact. 18 months was a conservative estimate, 24 was more likely. A man who spends 2 years on a trap does not abandon the trap because the first strike missed. He had resources she hadn't fully mapped. He had men inside the palace who had not yet revealed themselves. He had, presumably, contingencies. She thought about Evelyn Hart in the outer sitting room, 5 months pregnant with a child who had not chosen any of this, waiting to be received by the queen of an empire she had probably never expected to be inside, let alone to become the fulcrum of. She thought about the way the girl's hand had stayed at her stomach, even terrified, even in front of a queen with a hall full of court behind her. That hand had stayed. There was something to be learned from that, about what people hold on to when everything else is uncertain, about the specific shape of determination when it has nowhere elegant to go. Serafina turned from the window. Cressida, she said, send her in. Cressida went to the outer room. A moment passed. Then the door opened and Evelyn Hart came in. Still in the serving apron, the linen cap gone now so that her dark hair showed loose around her shoulders. Her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been operating at high tension for so long that the absence of immediate crisis had left nothing but the weight of what it cost. She stopped a few feet inside the door and looked at Serafina with the direct, careful attention of someone who had spent the last hour deciding whether to be afraid or not, and had arrived at a position that was neither entirely one nor entirely the other. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty." "Yes," Serafina said. "Sit down, Evelyn. I need to know everything." The girl sat and began to speak. She spoke for a long time, longer than Serafina had expected, which told her that the story was more intricate than it had appeared in the hall, more carefully layered, more deliberately constructed at its origins. Evelyn spoke haltingly at first, with the specific caution of someone who had been trained by fear into a habit of editing herself before every sentence, then gradually with less halting as the room failed to punish her for honesty. She talked about the night in the private dining chamber, the instructions she'd been given by the understeward she'd reported to for 8 months, a man named Torvey, who had told her it was a special assignment and that the king's private dinners required staff with exceptional discretion. She had not known. She had been, as she had said in the hall, a fool. She did not say this with self-pity. She said it with the flat accuracy of someone who had had 5 months to examine their own choices and had arrived at an accounting that was honest if uncomfortable. She talked about the men who had come to her afterward, 2 of them, neither in palace livery, who had arrived at the servants' quarters one morning before dawn, with a list of things that would happen to her family: her mother in the outer city, her younger brother who was apprenticed to a glassmaker on the river road, if she spoke about the arrangement. She had not described Cedric Vale by name. She had described a voice, a particular way of speaking, instructions that came through intermediaries but carried a cadence of absolute certainty that she had felt, she said, like being told the terms of weather. Not negotiable, not arguable, simply the condition of the world going forward. Serafina listened to all of it. She asked specific questions, dates, details, the exact phrasing of what she'd been told, the physical description of every person she'd interacted with from the original placement forward. She was not recording this for comfort. She was building a map. When Evelyn finished speaking, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire. "What happens to me now?" she said. "You stay here," Serafina said, "in the palace, under my direct protection. Your mother and brother are going to be brought inside the city walls within the next 2 days. I'll send riders tonight." Evelyn looked up. Something crossed her face, not relief exactly, the kind of expression that comes when a person who has been operating on the assumption that no good outcomes are available to them encounters an outcome that is not, in fact, bad. "Why?" she said. Serafina looked at her. "Because the people who arrange this are not finished," she said, "and you are the most direct and accessible thing they can still use. If you're under my protection, inside the palace, you become a liability for them rather than an asset." She paused. "That's the practical reason." "What's the other one?" It was a bold question, the kind that comes from someone who has been operating at the edge of their endurance for so long that the normal social calculations about what you're allowed to ask have been burned through. Serafina considered it. "My mother," she said finally, "died of a fever when I was 12. She had been ill for 2 months. During that time, there were 3 separate occasions where people who worked within her household were given the choice between their loyalty to her and the offer of something better from someone who wanted her position." She looked at the fire. On all 3 occasions, the person chose to stay. Evelyn was quiet. Not because they were paid more, not because they were threatened, because she had, at some earlier point, done something specific and human for each of them that they had not forgotten. Serafina was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if that's wisdom or luck. I've been trying to determine which for about 15 years. "It sounds like wisdom," Evelyn said. "Yes," Serafina said. "Everyone says that when I tell it. I still don't know." She stood. "Get some sleep. Master Aldrin will check on you in the morning. Don't speak to anyone about what we discussed tonight. Not because I distrust your judgment, but because the walls in this palace have a particular relationship with sound, and I need the people who are still watching you to believe they still have time." Evelyn stood. She was steadier than she'd been an hour ago. Not steady, but steadier. There is a difference. "Your Majesty," she said at the door. "What?" The thing you said in the hall. She looked at Serafina with the direct, careful attention she'd had from the beginning. About burning the empire. Yes. Did they believe you? Serafina looked at her for a moment. The ones who understood what they were looking at, she said, believed me. Evelyn nodded, once, and went. Cressida closed the door behind her. The fire had worked itself down to a steady low burn, the logs reduced to coals that threw a tight, honest light without the drama of the earlier blaze. Serafina sat back in the plain chair and looked at the grate and let herself, for the first time since she'd walked through the hall that evening, simply think. The shape of it was clear now. Cedric Vale had spent 2 years building a weapon out of Darius's weakness and a young woman's circumstances, designed to destroy the marriage publicly and fracture the throne from within in a way that would give him the constitutional pretext to call for a council review of the royal line. He had not expected her to protect Evelyn Hart. He had expected her to destroy the thing that humiliated her, the way most people destroy things that humiliate them, and in doing so become exactly the kind of unstable, compromised figure that the council could be persuaded to reconsider. She had not done that. But she had done something else. She had stood up in front of the entire court and told them clearly, in language that required no interpretation, that she knew a conspiracy was operating and that she intended to burn it out. She had done this without naming Cedric, without evidence, without the formal protocols that a charge of this weight required, which meant that right now, tonight, in whatever room of whatever estate he was sitting in, Cedric Vale knew she was coming. He would already be moving. She thought about the 3 faces in the hall: Fenwick, Galloway, Ruel. She thought about the under-steward Torvey, whose name she had now and whose movements she could begin tracing within the hour. She thought about the 2 men who had visited Evelyn before dawn. She thought about the underground routes beneath the palace, the maintenance passages that ran under the east wing and came out near the old mill road that she had walked herself during her first year at court, mapping them on a scrap of paper that she still kept folded in the back of the inner drawer of her writing desk. She thought about her uncle, 71 years old, the most powerful landed noble in the empire, a man who had outlasted 3 kings and 2 succession crises and who had built his position over decades with the patient, ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that power is not taken in dramatic moments. It is accumulated in the spaces between dramatic moments, in the quiet choices that nobody witnesses, in the long architecture of favor and debt and positioned loyalty. She had loved him once, when she was 11 years old, before she understood what he was. He had a particular laugh that she had liked. Not the court laugh, the real one, the one that came out when something genuinely surprised him. She had not heard it in years. She was not sure, thinking about it now, that she had heard it since the year she arrived at court, and he had realized that she was not going to be manageable. She allowed herself exactly as long as the last honest coal held its light to feel the weight of that. Then she stood up. "Get Heron," she said to Cressida, quietly. "Tell him to come alone and to tell no one where he's going." Cressida was already moving. "And check the east corridor gate," Serafina said. "The lower one, at the foot of the maintenance stairs. I want to know if it's been opened tonight." Cressida stopped, looked at her. "You think they're already inside," she said. Serafina picked up the lamp from the table beside her chair and turned toward the inner door of the apartments, the one that led to the private study, the writing desk, the drawer in the back. "I think," she said, "that a man who spends 2 years on a trap doesn't walk away from it after one missed strike." She moved to the desk, opened the back drawer. The paper was there, folded small. The ink faded at the creases from years of careful handling, a map of passages drawn in a hand that was 11 years younger and not yet entirely certain of its own ability to see clearly. She spread it flat on the desk. She had been right about almost everything, but as she traced the routes under the east wing with her finger, she found the one passage she had marked with a question, the one whose terminus she had never confirmed, and saw, in the margin, in her own handwriting from 15 years ago, a note she had written and never been able to verify. "Comes out where?" And in the candlelight, with the palace settling around her, and Evelyn Hart 4 rooms away, and Cedric Vale somewhere in the dark moving his pieces into their next positions, a door opened below. Not the main gate, not the guard rotation, the lower east corridor gate, the one that should have been locked. The sound came again. Not a rattling, Not the wind working at a loose hinge the way it did along the lower corridor when the eastern plane sent cold air through the gate seams. This was the specific, deliberate sound of iron moving against iron under the control of a hand that knew exactly where to apply pressure to minimize noise. Someone who had used that gate before. Someone who knew its weight and its tendency. Serafina folded the map and put it in the inner pocket of her dress. She did not call out. She did not move toward the door. She stood at the desk, with her hand still flat on the surface, and listened to the silence that followed the sound, the quality of it, the particular texture of a passage being navigated by people who understood that the absence of noise was itself a communication. More than one person. She could tell by the rhythm of it. The gate's sound had been brief and controlled, but the silence after it was not the silence of one body moving through a stone corridor. It had the specific density of multiple people holding their breath in sequence. She looked at the lamp. She put it out. The room went dark except for the coal glow from the hearth, which threw a low red light that flattened everything to shapes and edges. She moved from the desk to the wall beside the inner door, not behind it, beside it, where the shadow was heaviest and where she could see the door's movement if it opened without being immediately visible to whoever came through. She waited. The sound below had stopped, which meant they were already in the passage. She thought about Cressida, who had gone to find Heron, about the route Cressida would take, through the main corridor, down the residential stair, across the inner courtyard to the guard quarters. 7 minutes at a steady walk. 10 if she was being careful about not drawing attention. She thought about the map, about the passage terminus she had never confirmed, about the question she had written 15 years ago in the margin, comes out where? She now had a working hypothesis. The wall to her left was the interior wall, the one shared with the outer sitting room where Evelyn Hart had been sleeping for the last hour under a light blanket that Cressida had brought before leaving. The wall behind her was the study's exterior wall, stone 3 feet thick, facing east. The wall to her right was the one that backed against the servant's stairwell. The inner door was in front of her. If the passage terminated in the servant's stairwell, if it came up through the lower access point she'd never been able to verify, then whoever was in that passage would emerge roughly 20 feet from where she was standing. They would come out into the stairwell. They would need to cross the stairwell landing and come through either the sitting room or the study entrance to reach her apartments. They would not expect the lights to already be out. She breathed in, slow, through her nose. The hearth threw its low red shapes across the ceiling, and she stood in the shadow beside the door and let the darkness work for her. The inner door opened, not fast, carefully, with the same pressure-conscious deliberateness as the gate below. The hinges made no sound, which told her they had been oiled, which told her this entrance had been prepared in advance, which meant this was not an improvisation. This had been planned before tonight, before the feast. Perhaps long before. The shape that came through was a man, medium height, moving with the practiced quiet of someone trained for close work, dressed in the plain dark clothing of palace staff that could pass unremarked in any corridor below the royal floor. He stopped 2 steps inside the door. His eyes had not adjusted. "Looking for something?" Serafina said. He moved toward the sound, fast, trained, the kind of reflex that comes from years of close quarters work. And she was already not where the sound had come from because she'd spoken and immediately shifted left along the wall, and his hands found empty air, and the hearth light threw his silhouette against the opposite wall, and she saw the shape of what he was carrying before she saw his face. A blade. Short. Working length, not ceremonial. He turned. "There are 2 more in the sitting room," he said. His voice was flat and professional. Not threatening in the performed sense, just stating a fact, the way a tradesman states the terms of a job. "I know," she said. She did not, in fact, know there were exactly 2, but she knew there were more than 1. The number was close enough to be convincing, and the certainty in her voice cost her nothing. He paused. She could see him recalculating. The operation had been built on a specific set of assumptions, the first of which was that the target would be asleep or unprepared, and the second of which was that the darkness would work in his favor. Neither assumption had survived contact. "Who sent you?" she said. "You know who sent me. I want to hear you say it." "That's not how this works, Your Majesty." The title. He'd used the title, which meant he had been specifically instructed to. Someone wanted her to know this was political, not personal. Someone wanted her to understand in whatever time she had left that this was a formal act of removal rather than a crime of opportunity. It was the kind of distinction that mattered to men who needed to believe they were soldiers rather than killers. Your instruction, she said, were to come in through the lower passage, move through the sitting room, and reach the study. She watched him. But the sitting room is not empty. The girl is in there, and you were not told about the girl. His weight shifted. If you hurt her, Serafina said, you are not going home. Not because of me. Because the man who sent you has already decided that a clean operation with no witnesses is worth more to him than your continued existence. You hurt the girl, you become a witness. You're trying to buy time, he said. Yes, she said. And you're thinking about whether I'm right. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then a sound from the outer sitting room. A sharp intake of breath, female, cut off quickly. Not a scream. The specific sound of someone waking to find a hand over their mouth. Something in Serafina's chest went cold and compact. She moved, not toward the man. Past him, through the inner doorway, into the outer sitting room where the hearth had gone lower and the shapes were harder to read. She took in the room in the half-second before her vision adjusted. 2 figures near the far wall, one upright, one struggling. Evelyn, on the low chair bed where she'd been sleeping, with a second man crouched over her and a forearm pressed across her collarbone, and her hands pushing at his arm with the frantic, insufficient force of someone 5 months pregnant who understands exactly what a fall could cost. Get off her, Serafina said. The man looked up. His face was the face of someone who had not expected to be seen and was deciding whether that changed anything. He was bigger than the one in the study, broader. The kind of size that gives a man a particular confidence in enclosed spaces. He looked at Serafina, then at Evelyn, then at Serafina again. The order was for the Queen, he said. To the room, not to anyone specifically, as if clarifying terms. The order, Serafina said, was given by a man who is currently trying to determine whether he can afford to let either of us survive the night. She looked at him steadily. He can't. You already know this. You wouldn't have come in through the passage if you were meant to walk out the front gate afterward. The man's jaw tightened. The one from the study came through the doorway behind her. She felt rather than heard him, the slight displacement of air, the way the room's acoustics shifted. Don't, she said without turning. I know where your feet are. He stopped. The big man near Evelyn was still watching Serafina with the expression of someone running a calculation that was not going the way he had expected. His forearm had lifted slightly from Evelyn's collarbone. Not a release, but a loosening, the specific physical tell of a man whose certainty has developed a fissure. Evelyn's eyes were on Serafina. Dark, direct, terrified but not gone. The same quality she'd had in the hall earlier. The same refusal to fold entirely, even when everything around her was giving her reasons to. Her hand was at her stomach. The same hand. The same position. Something shifted in Serafina's chest. Not softness. The opposite of softness. The specific hardness that comes from seeing a thing clearly and deciding that its protection is not negotiable. I'm going to tell you something, she said to both men, because I think at least one of you is capable of hearing it. Neither spoke. The man who sent you has spent 2 years building a trap, and tonight it failed. When a careful man's careful trap fails, his first instinct is not to abandon the project. It's to remove the variable that caused the failure. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. You are variables. So is the girl. So am I. But I am the one variable that, if removed tonight, gives him everything he wants. The girl and the 2 of you are just the cleanup. The man near Evelyn had fully released the pressure on her collarbone. He was still crouched beside her, but his hands had dropped to his thighs. Step away from her, Serafina said. Both of you stand at the far wall. You're not in a position to... Look at me. She said it without raise, without the performance of command. Just the flat directness of a woman who was fully inside what she was saying. Look at my face and decide whether I am uncertain. He looked. He stood. He moved to the far wall. The one behind her moved with him, not because he'd been ordered to, but because the specific gravity of the moment had shifted and following it was the only thing that made sense. Serafina crossed the room to Evelyn. She crouched in front of her, eye level, close enough to speak quietly. Are you hurt? Evelyn's breathing was fast and shallow. Her hand was still at her stomach. No, I'm not hurt. Can you stand? Yes. Then stand up and move to the door behind me. The main corridor door. Open it and start shouting. Don't stop until someone answers. Evelyn stood. She was shaking in a way that was not voluntary. The specific tremor of a body that has pushed through fear and come out the other side into the territory where the body does the accounting regardless of what the mind wants. She moved to the door, opened it, and her voice came out strong in the corridor, louder than Serafina had expected, with a raw-edged quality that had no performance in it. The two men at the far wall heard it. The one who had spoken, the smaller of the two, the one from the study, looked at Serafina with an expression that was no longer professional. It was the expression of a man doing a very fast accounting of his available options and finding the column shorter than he'd planned. "He's going to cut you loose," Serafina said to him. "You know he will. The moment this operation fails completely, and it has failed, you become a liability. You know his name, you know this passage, you know tonight." She looked at him steadily. "But I don't need what he needs. I don't need you gone. I need what you know." The man stared at her. "I need the passage's full route," she said. "I need the name of whoever oiled those hinges. I need to know how long you've been running access through this floor and who authorized the gate key." She paused. "Give me those things, and you walk out of this palace under your own power." "He'll know I talked. He already thinks you failed. That's the same thing to a man like him." She held his gaze. "The question is whether failing with something to offer is better than failing with nothing." The sound of boots in the corridor. Multiple, moving fast. Heron's men, she thought, or Cressida had found someone closer. The man made his decision in the half-second before the corridor door came open and two royal guards entered with drawn weapons. He made it the way men under terminal pressure make decisions, not with calculation, but with the specific resignation of someone choosing the lesser damage. "Torvi," he said. "He has 3 others on the residential floor. And the passage—" He stopped, looked at the guards, then at Serafina. "The passage comes up inside the wall of the east study. There's a second entrance, built before your time." "Before whose time?" she said. He looked at her. "Before the king's time," he said. "Built when the previous lord held these rooms." The previous lord, her uncle's apartments. These had been Cedric Vale's rooms for 12 years before Darius's father reassigned them to the queen's residential suite. The passage had not been built for the purposes of tonight. It had been built by Cedric Vale for Cedric Vale 2 decades ago, for reasons that were probably mundane at the time. And he had never told anyone it existed, because a man who plans 20 years ahead does not give up his advantages. Serafina stood. "Take them to the lower hold," she said to the guards. "Not the regular cells. The lower hold. No visitors, no communications, no contact with any other prisoner or staff until I personally authorize it." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And find Torvi. He's on the residential floor. Move quietly. I want him before he knows we're coming." The guards moved. Serafina turned to the window. Cressida appeared in the corridor doorway, Heron 2 steps behind her. The general was in a hastily assembled version of his regular uniform, missing the outer coat, his gray hair disordered from what had apparently been a very rapid departure from wherever he'd been found. He took in the room in 2 seconds. The disturbed bed, the Evelyn Hart standing pale and shaking by the far wall, the absence of the 2 men who had clearly been in the room moments before, and his face went through a compressed sequence of expressions that ended on something that was not quite anger and not quite alarm, but contained elements of both. "Your Majesty," he said. "Sit down, Heron." He sat in the chair nearest the door without ceremony. Cressida went to Evelyn, put a hand on her arm, said something low that Serafina didn't catch. "They came through the east study wall," Serafina said. "There's a passage built into the structure before Darius's father took the palace. Full access from a lower gate in the east corridor to the queen's residential suite." She looked at Heron. "I need the passage mapped, sealed, and every access point under guard within the hour." "Done," Heron said. He was not a man who required extended briefings to move. It was why she had sent for him specifically. "There are at least 3 more on the residential floor. A man named Torvi, the understeward, who placed the girl in the king's private dining chamber 8 months ago. Get him first." "Alive?" "Preferably." She paused. "Necessarily." Heron stood. He was already composing the operational order in his head. She could tell by the specific quality of his focus, the way it narrowed to a single point when he was moving from assessment to action. "Heron!" He stopped. "The king's rooms are on this floor," she said. "West corridor. Post 2 men. Don't tell him why. Heron looked at her for a moment, reading the instruction, reading what it implied about the state of the king's own awareness of tonight. His expression did not change, but something moved through his eyes. Yes, Your Majesty. He left. The room went quieter. Serafina stood at the window and looked at the east grounds, the dark geometry of the outer walls, the thin strip of pale sky at the horizon that was not yet dawn, but was the specific gray that comes in the hour before it. The palace below was beginning its pre-dawn movements, the kitchen fires being built, the stable staff starting their first rotation, the guard shift preparing to change. All of it normal. All of it the surface pattern of a machine continuing to run while something structural shifted inside its workings. Evelyn was sitting on the low chair bed again, Cressida's hand still on her arm. Her breathing had steadied. Her face had the particular flatness of someone who has moved through the far side of a crisis and arrived at a stillness that is not calm, but functions like it. I keep ending up in rooms with you, Evelyn said, that I didn't expect to survive. That's a better average than most people get, Serafina said. Evelyn looked at her. Something crossed her face. Not quite a laugh, not quite its opposite. What happens now, she said. Now I find out whether the men they sent tonight were the whole operation or the leading edge of it. Serafina turned from the window. The passage gives us Cedric Vale's direct involvement in a physical intrusion on royal property. That's not a rumor. That's not political maneuvering. That is actionable by imperial law without a council vote. You can use it against him. I can use it to move against him, Serafina said. Using it against him requires evidence that survives the challenge of his legal team, his council allies, and whatever documentation he's prepared in anticipation of exactly this kind of exposure. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He prepared for you, she said. He's been preparing for me for a very long time. Then he knows you're coming. He's known since the feast. Serafina picked up the lamp from the desk and relit it from the hearth coals. The room re-emerged from the flat red dark into something more detailed and specific. What he doesn't know is the shape of what I've built. He knows I collect information. He doesn't know how much. He prepared for a reactive queen, someone who would move on the evidence she had tonight and expose her hand before she had the full structure mapped. But you're not going to do that, Evelyn said. No. You're going to wait. I'm going to finish the map, Serafina said, and then I'm going to give him a reason to move first. The hearth behind her shifted, a log settling into its own collapse, throwing a brief orange flare before dropping back to embers. Outside, somewhere in the east corridor, there was the sound of boots and the short, cut-off exclamation of a man being taken by surprise. Torvi, she thought, found. She looked at the lamp in her hand. The flame sat steady in the still air of the room, burning clean with no flicker. Somewhere below, in whatever room of the palace he was currently occupying, Cedric Vale's men had failed to reach her. By morning he would know the passage was compromised. By morning he would know 2 of his people were in the lower hold. By morning he would know that the operation he had spent 2 years building had broken against a woman who had been awake in the dark and waiting for exactly this. And by morning he would have started building something else. That was the thing about men who thought in decades. They did not stop. They adapted. She set the lamp on the desk. Cressida was watching her from the far side of the room with the specific attention of a woman who had spent 22 years reading the difference between Serafina thinking and Serafina deciding. She had seen both enough to know they looked almost identical from the outside and produced very different outcomes. What do you need? Cressida said. Get the writing case, Serafina said. The small one. And find me the record of every property transfer and estate document that moved through the Imperial Registry in the last 18 months. Cressida moved. Tonight? She said. Before dawn, Serafina said. I need to know if Cedric has been moving assets. If he has? Serafina sat at the desk and looked at the blank paper in front of her. A man who moves assets before a confrontation is a man who has already decided the confrontation will not go in his favor. A man who has decided that abandons the careful, patient game and reaches for the emergency architecture, the contingencies built precisely for the moment when everything else has failed. She thought about the underground passages, about the question in the margin of her map. Comes out where? She had been asking about a physical location. She was now asking about something else entirely. If he has, she said, then we're not waiting for him to move first. She picked up the pen. And in the pre-dawn gray of a palace that was quietly, invisibly sealing its own exits around a conspiracy that did not yet know it had been surrounded, a messenger arrived at the east gate, riding hard from the direction of Cedric Vale's estate, asking, with the specific urgency of a man who had ridden through the night, for immediate audience with the king. The messenger's name was Oren. He was 23 years old, rode for Cedric Vale's household, and had the specific look of a man who had been given a task he did not understand and told to execute it without questions. Mud on his boots to the knee, horse lathered and head dropped in the east courtyard, eyes that moved too fast around the gate room, not from guilt, but from the particular anxiety of someone carrying a package whose contents he hadn't been told. Serafina had him brought to the lower receiving room rather than the gatehouse. She sat across from him at the plain table the stewards used for supply inventories, in a chair that put her face in the lamplight and his in the shadow, and she looked at him for a full 5 seconds before she spoke. "Who gave you the message?" "Lord Vale's head steward, Your Majesty, Master Gren. He said it was urgent and that it was for the king specifically, and that I was to give it to me." He hesitated. 1 second. The specific hesitation of a man whose instructions said king and whose instincts said this woman is not someone who repeats herself. He gave it to her. She broke the seal without theatrics, a clean snap, the wax giving without ceremony. Unfolded the paper. Read it again. The letter was short, 8 lines in Cedric Vale's cramped, precise hand, the script of a man who had learned penmanship at the same age he'd learned everything else, as a tool, not an art. It stated, in the specific language of a formal imperial communication, that Lord Cedric Vale had come into possession of evidence material to the security of the throne, that this evidence implicated individuals within the royal household at the highest levels, that he was requesting immediate private audience with King Darius Blackthorn before the evidence was formally presented to the Imperial Council at its next convening. Not a threat. Not quite. The particular architecture of an offer made in bad faith, the shape of help extended by a hand that was holding a knife behind its back. She folded the letter. Oren was watching her with the careful neutrality of a young man trying not to be in the room for whatever was happening. "Did Master Gren tell you to wait for a reply?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then wait." She stood. The receiving room had 2 doors. She took the one that led toward the residential stair, moving through the pre-dawn corridor with the lamp in one hand and the letter in the other, thinking about the word implicated and the phrase highest levels and the specific calculation behind sending a formal communication rather than a private one. He was creating a record. That was the thing. A formal letter with a seal and a messenger who could be called as a witness. Cedric Vale was not acting like a man who had failed. He was acting like a man who had already repositioned and was now building a new structure on the ruins of the old one. The passage intrusion had been the blunt instrument. This letter was the scalpel. She climbed the stair. Heron met her at the top. "Torvi?" she said. "Secured," Heron said. "Lower hold." He didn't resist. He paused. "He's frightened, Your Majesty. Genuinely. Not performed frightened. The kind of frightened that talks." "Not yet. I need him to sit with it until I'm ready." She handed him the letter. "Read that." He read. His face did not change in any demonstrative way. Heron had been a general for 19 years and had learned to keep his reactions interior where they belonged. But the set of his jaw tightened on the word implicated. "He's going on offense," Heron said. "He's already been on offense. This is the formal declaration." She took the letter back. "He has something. Something built independently of tonight. The passage, the men, the Torvi connection. Whatever he has survived tonight intact." Heron looked at her. "How independent?" It was the right question, the question she had been sitting with since the moment she finished reading. "I don't know yet," she said. "But he sent this letter before he could have received word that the passage operation failed, which means this was already in motion before tonight, which means—" "He has more than one thread running," Heron said. "He always has more than one thread running." She moved down the corridor. "I need to see the king." Darius was awake. I was standing at the window of his private study in the kind of disheveled composure that came from a man who had not slept and had not quite admitted it to himself yet. The outer coat gone, the collar of his shirt open, his hair showing the compression of a pillow he had only briefly used. He turned when she came in, and she saw in his face the specific expression of a man who had spent several dark hours with his own accounting and had not arrived at a comfortable total. She put the letter on the desk in front of him. He read it. The silence in the room had the quality of a word being formed, the specific tension of a thought building towards speech that hadn't found its shape yet. He has something, Darius said. Yes. On me, possibly. She sat down. Possibly on someone close to you, possibly fabricated with enough structural integrity to survive initial challenge. She looked at him. The phrase he used was highest levels. That's designed to make you uncertain about every person around you. Darius set the letter down. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind him, looking out at the grounds in the way he looked at terrain he was about to move troops across. Not aimlessly, but with the specific directed attention of a man mapping lines of approach. If I don't see him, he goes to the council, Serafina said. Whatever he has gets presented in a formal context where the spectacle of it matters more than the accuracy. The council hasn't been entirely clean for a decade, and he knows which votes he holds. And if I do see him? He delivers his offer in private, protection for whatever he has, in exchange for something. She paused. Likely my removal from the royal household in some formal capacity, possibly my trial, depending on what he's built. Darius turned. Your trial, he said. Flat. Not a question. It would be the cleanest outcome for him. A queen implicated in some manufactured conspiracy against the throne. It neutralizes me, removes the complication of tonight, and leaves him positioned as the man who protected the empire from internal corruption. She held his gaze. It's elegant. If I were building against him, it's what I would build. I was looking at her with the expression she had learned to read years ago, the one where he was running two separate processes simultaneously, one strategic and one personal, and the personal one was getting ahead of the strategic. He built a case against you, Darius said. He built something. I don't know its shape yet. Then we need to know its shape before we... Darius. She said his name with the precise weight of a woman who needed him to stop moving and listen. I need you to hear me clearly. Whatever he sends you, whatever documentation, whatever testimony, whatever evidence he presents, I need you to receive it and respond as if you believe it. The silence that followed was of a different kind than any that had come before it. You want me to act like I think you're... I want you to give him reason to believe his plan is working. He needs to move toward his next stage, and I need to know what that stage is before I close the structure around him. She looked at him steadily. I have everything except the shape of the final piece. I need him to show it to me. Darius was very still. This is what you've been doing, he said. Slowly. Not with accusation, with the specific quality of a man arriving at a realization that recontextualizes a significant portion of what he thought he understood. Not just tonight, not just these last weeks. Yes. How long? She looked at him. How long? He said again, and this time the specific weight in his voice was not strategic. It was personal and it was raw, and it had the quality of a man who was deciding whether the answer was something he wanted to receive. Since the second year, she said. Since Lord Fenwick's first attempt to introduce substitute documentation into the Eastern trade agreements. Since I realized your uncle had funded Fenwick's appointment in the first place and had been inside your household apparatus for longer than either of us had been married. The room held. Outside, the sky at the horizon had gone from pre-dawn gray to the specific pale that precedes actual light. Not daybreak, but the promise of it. The sky doing its preparatory work before the sun arrived to make everything visible. You never told me, he said. No. Why? She thought about how to answer this. Not the diplomatic answer, the true one, which was harder to shape because it required honesty about the specific calculus of trust as it had existed between them in those early years, before the campaigns, before the distance that grew in the particular way distance grows between two people who are busy and committed, and not, if either of them was being accurate, entirely present to what they had built. Because the safest intelligence is intelligence held by one person, she said, and because in the second year I didn't yet know which of your advisors he owned, I didn't know if telling you would tell him. You didn't trust me, he said. I didn't trust your access points, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet. She let him be quiet. There was nothing to be managed in this moment. It was simply the moment arriving, the specific shape of what 8 years of marriage looked like, when the surface was removed and the structure underneath was examined with honest light. It was not what either of them would have designed. It was what they had built in the circumstances they'd had. I'm asking you to do something difficult, she said. I know what it requires. I need your answer. He looked at her. Tell me what to say to the messenger, he said. She told him. The audience with Cedric Vale was set for 3 days hence. Heron was instructed to make the security arrangements visible, obvious enough that Cedric would see them and understand they were theater, which was itself information she needed him to have. The 2 men from the passage remained in the lower hold under strict isolation. Torvi remained untouched. She went back to the writing case. For the next 2 hours, in the specific concentrated quiet of a pre-dawn that had cleared of immediate crisis but not of danger, she worked through the estate transfer records that Cressida had pulled, property movements, registry filings, the particular paper trail left by a man shifting his most defensible assets into positions that would survive a formal legal challenge to his title. He had moved 3 properties, 2 to a nephew whose name appeared in the records 4 times in the last year, recently, repetitively, in the specific pattern of a man being established as a viable heir to something. 1 to a charitable instrument that existed primarily on paper and whose governing documents, when she read through the copies Cressida had located in the secondary registry files, contained language about continuity of mission in the event of the founding party's incapacitation. Not death. Incapacitation. I was not planning to die. He was planning to be removed, tried, stripped, and to survive it because the assets would be beyond the crown's reach, and the nephew would be the new face of the Vale faction with clean hands and a clean record. She understood the shape of it now. Not all of it. Not the specific document he was holding, the one that implicated someone at the highest levels. But the structure around it was clear enough. He had built a scenario in which his removal from power was not the end of his influence. It was the mechanism of its transformation. He would be martyred, and the martyrdom would be the foundation his heir built on. She set down the pen. The sun was fully up. Cressida brought food she didn't eat and tea she did. Evelyn Hart was sleeping in the outer room, finally and genuinely. The palace had moved into its full morning operations, and the banquet hall was being cleared below, the evidence of last night's feast dismantled with the professional efficiency of staff who had learned not to remark on what happened in that room. She was sitting at the desk looking at the estate documents when the knock came. Not Cressida. Not Heron. She knew the knock. Come in, she said. Darius came in. He looked better than he had 3 hours ago. Sleep he had apparently managed, the coat back in its proper position, his face carrying the particular composed resolve of a man who had made a decision and was standing behind it. He stopped at the edge of the desk and looked at the documents spread across its surface. The assets, he said. He's moved 3 properties. 1 is a charitable instrument with continuity language. She looked up. He's planning to survive his own fall. Darius was quiet, reading the visible documents. His nephew, he said. The young one. Aldrich Vale. She went still. You know him. He's been at court for 6 months, Darius said. He was looking at the papers with an expression that was doing something Serafina could not immediately read. Not surprise, not concern, but something adjacent to both. Something that had the quality of a man looking at a picture he had seen before, and only now recognizing where he'd seen it. He came in through the military intake, junior officer position in the Eastern Garrison. I approved the appointment myself. Serafina looked at him. Who recommended him? She said. Darius met her eyes, and she saw it. The specific expression of a man who had just felt the ground shift under a weight he had been standing on for 6 months without knowing it was unstable. Heron, he said. The room went very quiet. Not the silence of a crowd. Not the silence of 2 people finding their footing after hard conversation. The specific silence of a system reaching its limit. The sound a thing makes in the last moment before it changes entirely. She stood up. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands when the action of standing is buying their mind the fraction of a second it needs to refuse what it has just been told. Because Heron had been her first call tonight. Heron was the man she had trusted with Torvi's capture. Heron was the man whose men were guarding this corridor right now. When was the appointment approved? She said. 6 months ago. Darius's voice had gone flat. February, before the Eastern campaign ended. Who handled the paperwork? The military intake runs through the general's office. He stopped. Through Heron's office. She was already moving, not running. That would alert the guards in the corridor. And she did not know yet which guards were Heron's in a way that was different from which guards were the Crown's. and until she knew that she could not afford to trigger a response she couldn't control. She moved at a pace that looked purposeful rather than urgent, into the corridor, toward the residential stair. Darius followed without being asked. She took the stair to the lower floor, through the side passage toward the hold where Torvi and the two passagemen were being kept. She was thinking with a specific, cold clarity that had no feeling in it yet. The feeling would come later. It always came later. But right now what was operational was the part of her that had been trained since 11 years old to take what she was seeing and move through it, rather than stopping to process it. If Heron had placed Aldrich Vale in the Eastern Garrison on Cedric's instruction, then Heron had known about the Vale operation for at minimum 6 months. If Heron had known for 6 months, he had known about Torvi. He had known about the passage. He had known about tonight. And he had come when she called him, gone where she sent him, and put his men exactly where she told him to put them. The lower hold had 2 guards at the entrance. She knew them both. Faces she had seen on rotation for 2 years, men whose names she had filed in the section of her memory designated for staff who were reliable enough to trust with minor logistical tasks. She looked at their faces. Nothing unusual, no specific tension, no, the thing I was afraid she would do she is doing quality in their posture. "Open the hold," she said. One of them moved to comply. He lifted the bar, pulled the door, stepped aside. She walked in. The hold had 3 rooms separated by iron-barred interior gates. The first room was empty. The second held the larger of the 2 passagemen, sitting against the far wall with his wrists secured, head up, watching the door with the alert stillness of a man who had been waiting for something. The third room was open. The iron gate hung on its hinge, pulled back. The smaller man, the one who had talked, the one who had given her Torvi's name and the passage detail and the information she had leveraged the rest of the night on, was gone. Torvi's room was empty. She stood in the doorway of the empty room and looked at the barred window, intact, undamaged, not an exit, and then at the gate, which showed no sign of forced opening. A key. Someone had used a key. She turned. The large man was watching her from behind his bars, with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite apology. The expression of a man who had given the outcome that was asked of him. "He said you'd figure it out," the man said, "just not this fast." She looked at him. "Heron," she said. "You got half of it," the man said. "Only half." She was already turning back to the door, and the cold in her chest had spread outward into her hands and her jaw. And the specific clarity of thought that comes when a situation has fully revealed its actual dimensions rather than the ones you are managing. She had been moving pieces on a board for 2 years. She had been careful and patient and precise. She had been playing inside the board Cedric Vale had built. And Heron, who had been her first call tonight. Heron, who had been her father's recommendation when she came to court as a 14-year-old girl needing a military contact she could trust. Heron, who had put his knee on the floor in that hall with the rest of them and looked at her like she was worth kneeling for. Heron had walked Torvi out. Darius was in the hold entrance behind her, and she heard his breathing change when he understood what the empty room meant. "He's been running to him," Darius said. She didn't answer. She was standing in the hold with the iron door open and the pre-morning sun cutting through the narrow window, and the whole structure of what she had believed she was doing in the last 8 hours rearranging itself into a shape she did not yet fully see. She thought about this passage letter, the formal communication, the careful language, the record it created. Cedric Vale had not been repositioning after the failure of tonight. He had been completing a move that had already been in progress. The passage operation, the messenger, the letter requesting audience. They were not separate responses to a failed plan. They were a single sequence, the steps of it visible only when you stepped back far enough to see the whole line. He had wanted the passagemen captured. He had wanted Torvi captured. He had wanted her to find the connection to Heron, because the connection to Heron was not the real weapon. It was the path to the real weapon. And now Torvi was in the wind with whatever he knew, and Heron was... "Where is Heron now?" she said. Darius said, "I sent him to the East Garrison, to find Aldrich Vale, who was already gone," she thought, who had been gone since before dawn, who had carried whatever was in Cedric Vale's holding to wherever Cedric Vale needed it to be. She walked out of the hold, up the stair, through the corridor, back to the study. She stood at the desk. She looked at the estate documents, the properties, the charitable instrument with its continuity language, the nephew with his clean record. She looked at the map folded in her inner pocket. The old map, the one with the question in the margin. The question she had thought was about a physical location. She had been wrong about that too. The passage didn't just come out under the East Study. Looking at the topology now, with Heron's knowledge of the palace included, it extended further. The routing through the servants' stairwell was a branch, not the terminus. She hadn't mapped the full length because she hadn't had the information to map it. And the full length, if she was right about the geography, came out in the lower records vault, where the original documentation of the Queen's authority over the Crown's legal counsel was stored, where the letters she had written under seal over the last 2 years were archived, where the evidence she had been building against the Vale faction, the evidence that was the only weapon she had left, was kept. She pressed her hand flat against the desk. The stone beneath her feet was the same stone it had always been. The palace was the same palace. Darius was somewhere behind her in the corridor, coming fast, and the sun was fully up outside the window, and everything was exactly as material and real as it had been when she sat down at this desk 8 hours ago. She had built her case for 2 years, and if Cedric Vale had accessed the lower records vault, if Heron had opened that door, she was going to walk in there and find either empty shelves or something worse, something that had been changed, something that would make the evidence she had built look, to any counsel that examined it, exactly like what he had always planned to say it was. The fabrication of a queen who had been working against the throne all along. She picked up the lamp. She looked at the door. She had 2 choices left. Move before he expected her to move, with evidence she hadn't yet verified might still exist, or wait for the council summons, wait for the formal process, the public presentation, the machinery of imperial law grinding toward a verdict that Cedric Vale had been building toward for 2 decades, with a general at his side who knew every door she might run through. She moved. The records vault was at the end of the lower east corridor, behind a door that required 2 keys. The Crown Archivist's and the Queen's own, held separately as a constitutional safeguard against unilateral access. Serafina had carried her key on her person since the day she was given it. She had never lent it. She had never copied it. She had checked the door's seal personally on the last day of every month for 2 years. She checked it now. The seal was intact. She stood in the corridor with the lamp held level and looked at the wax impression for a long time, running her thumb along its edge, checking the depth of the impression, the specific microfractures that accumulated in aged wax versus fresh. She had pressed this seal herself 3 weeks ago. She knew its texture the way she knew the weight of her own crown. It was intact. She unlocked the door. The vault was a long, low room with stone shelving on 3 walls and a central table worn smooth from decades of use. Document boxes arranged in her specific system, chronological within category, cross-referenced by a notation she had developed herself and written in a cipher that used her mother's name as its base key. No one else knew the cipher. She had written it down nowhere. She moved to the 3rd shelf, 2nd row. Her hand found this box without hesitation, pulled it, opened it. The documents were there. All of them. Undisturbed, in order, the top sheet carrying the specific slight curl at the corner she had noted last month, without noting why she'd noted it. The unconscious archival instinct of a woman who had spent 2 years treating this room as the most important room in the empire. She stood at the central table and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of the specific relief that comes not from safety, but from the absence of the worst outcome. Then she closed the box. The vault was intact, which meant Cedric Vale had not accessed it, which meant either Heron had not known about the vault's contents specifically, had not been given enough detail to know what to take, or Vale had made a different calculation about what he needed from tonight. She was rerunning the sequence. The passagemen. Torvi extracted. Heron positioned. The formal letter already in transit before the passage operation even completed. He hadn't needed the vault. He had something else. She locked the door. She was walking fast now. Not running, but the specific compressed pace of a woman whose mind was 3 steps ahead of her body and pulling. Back through the lower corridor, up the stair, into the East Wing's main passage, where the morning light was coming fully through the narrow windows, and 2 palace staff were moving with their heads down, and the particular studied invisibility of people who had learned last night that something was happening that they did not want to be adjacent to. Darius met her at the stairs' top landing. "The vault?" he said. "Intact." She kept moving. "He didn't go for the vault. Then what? He doesn't need what's in the vault," she said. He needs what's in the council chamber, the formal record. She stopped, turned, looked at Darius with the concentrated directness of someone who needed an answer in the next 3 seconds. The council's last formal session. Who recorded the minutes? Galloway's secretary. Galloway. The minister with the border estates and the tax petition. The third face in the hall last night, the one who had been looking at the table when she spoke. Galloway was in the hall last night, she said. Yes. He saw everything. He heard everything. She was already moving again. He's the record keeper. If Cedric needs documentation that presents a specific version of events, a version where what happened last night looks like instability or treason rather than what it actually was, Galloway can produce it. He controls the formal record. Darius was keeping pace beside her, and she could feel the specific quality of his focus shifting from reactive to operational. The change that happened in him when a situation clarified enough to move on. It was one of the things she had always respected about him. He was not a man who needed long to get there, once the shape was clear. Galloway left the feast early, Darius said. I noticed. Didn't register it then. He was told to. I can call him in. Not yet. She stopped outside the door to the secondary council anteroom, the small room adjacent to the main chamber where the session logs were physically stored between meetings. If we pull Galloway before we know what Cedric is asking him to produce, we show our hand on the one thing Cedric doesn't know we've connected. Then what do we do? She looked at the door. She thought about the charitable instrument, the nephew with clean hands, the formal letter requesting audience with the king, not the queen. Every piece of it structured to put her on the defensive, to require her to respond through channels that Cedric had already pre-positioned, to force her into the machinery of imperial process, where his patience and his placed men were advantages that outweighed everything she had built. She had been trying to finish the map before she moved. The map was never going to be finished. That was the trap inside the trap. The patient woman waiting for the perfect picture, while the patient old man kept adding frames. We move now, she said. Before the council convenes, before Galloway produces anything, before the audience gives Cedric the formal platform he needs. On what grounds? Darius said. Legally. The passage. She turned. 2 men sent through a concealed route into the royal residential suite, Darius the night. Armed. That is not a political act, that is an attempt on the crown. Imperial law does not require a council vote to respond to an attempt on the crown. It requires the king's direct order. Darius looked at her. She looked at him. There was a moment, not long, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, where the weight of what she was asking settled fully between them. She was asking him to move against his own uncle-in-law without the formal process that the man had spent 20 years positioning himself to survive. She was asking him to commit to a public action before the evidence was perfect, before the council was aligned, before any of the cautious preparatory work that conventional imperial jurisprudence required. She was asking him to trust her, not her intelligence, not her planning, her. After 8 years and a pregnant maid and a passage in the wall, and a general who had knelt on the stone floor of the banquet hall and looked at her like she was worth it, and then walked Torvi out of the lower hold before dawn. Darius said, Tell me what you need. She told him. The orders went out in Darius's name within the hour. Not through the standard council distribution, not through the administrative chain that Cedric Vale had spent 2 decades embedding his people in. Through the direct military command line. Through General Reyes, who was the 2nd general of the Eastern Garrison, and whom Heron had never liked and therefore probably never tried to turn. Through the Crown's personal courier, bypassing every ministerial office. Lord Cedric Vale was to be brought to the palace. Not invited, not summoned, brought. She was in the throne room when the response came back. Not a reply from Cedric's estate. A reply from the rider who had gone to collect him. He was already on the road. He had left his estate before dawn, traveling with a full-armed retinue of 30 men, moving toward the capital on the Imperial Road at a pace that suggested he had not been waiting for an invitation. Serafina stood in the throne room and held the courier's report and let the calculation run. 30 men on the Imperial Road at dawn, after the passage had failed, after the messenger had been sent. He was not coming to be received. He was coming to complete something. Bar the south gate, she said to the room. Leave the east gate open. Leave it specifically and visibly open. She looked at the captain of the throne room guard, a woman named Voss, compact and expressionless, who had been in this post for 3 years, and had the particular useful quality of executing orders without requiring the reasoning behind them. When his retinue arrives, let the first 3 riders through. Stop the rest outside. Yes, Your Majesty. And bring Evelyn Hart to the antechamber off the throne room. She paused. Don't tell her why. Tell her I asked for her specifically. Voss moved. Darius came in from the side entrance, coat properly fastened now, the crown signet ring on his right hand that he wore formally and had not been wearing when they spoke earlier. He had made his own decision about what this day required. He looked at her in the throne room with the morning light coming through the high windows and the empty court seats, arranged in their formal rows, and the specific quality of a room that was built for spectacle, waiting to be used. He's 30 minutes out, he said. I know. He's going to walk in here and present whatever he has in the most public setting he can manage. Darius moved to stand beside her, not at his throne, beside her at the same level. He'll have documentation, witnesses possibly. He'll have Heron, she said. Heron is the witness. That's what Torvi's extraction was for. Not to hide Torvi, but to move Heron into position as the surviving credible source on tonight's events. A general's testimony on an attempted coup outweighs anyone I can produce. Except the men in the hold. He'll argue they were working for me, that the passage operation was mine, that I staged it to manufacture evidence against him. She had run this argument a dozen times in the last hour. It was clean. It was almost airtight. It's good work. He built it well. Can we break it? She thought about Evelyn Hart's hand at her stomach, about the quality of holding that had nothing to do with strategy. Yes, she said, but not the way he expects. The throne room filled in the next 20 minutes. Not by invitation, but by the specific gravity of proximity. The way court members accumulated in a space where something important was about to happen, even when no one officially announced it. Ministers, lesser nobles, household staff at the periphery. 2 of the foreign dignitaries who had been at last night's feast, and apparently had either nowhere to be or good instincts about the value of witnessing history. Cedric Vale came through the east gate exactly as she had intended. She had last seen him in person 4 months ago, at a formal review of the Eastern Campaign's administrative outcomes. He had been cordial, precise, and had spent 3 hours presenting data that was technically accurate and deliberately organized to make the campaign's costs look higher and its gains look more ambiguous than they were. She had said nothing in the meeting. She had written 7 pages of notes afterward. He walked into the throne room at 68 years old with the specific authority of a man who had been the most powerful person in most rooms for longer than many of the people in this one had been alive. Not tall, compact, measured, with white hair cut short, and the deliberate economy of movement that comes from people who have learned that stillness projects more force than action. He was dressed formally. The veil crest on his outer coat, his hands free and visible, which was its own kind of statement. He had 2 men with him, not the 30 from the road. Those had been stopped at the gate, which he would have noted, and which did not appear to change anything in his bearing. He had prepared for this specific possibility. He stopped at the floor's center. He looked at Darius, then briefly at Seraphina, then back to Darius. Your Majesty, he said, thank you for seeing me. You came without waiting for confirmation, Darius said. The matter was urgent. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document with the specific care of a man presenting something he has prepared to present for a long time. I have here a sworn testimony, witnessed by 3 members of the Imperial Council and sealed under their authority, attesting to a pattern of unauthorized intelligence operations conducted from within the royal household over a period of not less than 2 years. The room absorbed this. Operations, Seraphina said. He looked at her. His eyes were the particular gray-blue of old iron, and they had the quality of eyes that had spent decades assessing what they looked at and being correct. Conducted in your name, he said, without royal sanction, without council oversight, using palace resources, crown correspondence, and the unauthorized surveillance of imperial ministers. He placed the document on the floor between them, not offered to a hand, placed, like a thing being laid as evidence. Constitutionally, this represents grounds for a formal review of your standing as, Heron wrote it, she said. A pause. Not long. 1 second. The testimony is sworn and witnessed by I know who witnessed it, she said. Fenwick, Galloway, and Ruel. The three council members whose names I could have given you before you walked through that door, because they are the three members you have owned for long enough that their signatures on your documentation are not evidence. They are a signature list of your own faction. Cedric Vale looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, she noted. Not anger. Something more complicated. The expression of a man looking at an opponent he had underestimated by a specific and measurable margin and recalculating in real time. You have one general, she said. You have three council members. You have a document produced in the hours after an operation that failed. She moved down from the dais, not toward him, away from the throne, into the open floor where the room could see her without the elevation of the platform. And you have 30 men outside my east gate who are currently being counted by the garrison commander, and whose presence on Imperial Road in armed formation without crown authorization is itself an actionable offense. The testimony stands regardless of my... Your men went through a passage in the east wall last night, she said. They came into my residential suite. One of them held a pregnant woman down by the throat. These are not allegations. I have two of them in the lower hold. I have the gate key they used, which was cut from a copy made of a key that has been in your possession since before these rooms were assigned to the Queen's household. She held his gaze. That is not a constitutional matter. That is a criminal one. The room had gone very still. Cedric Vale was looking at her with an expression that was still composed and still controlled, but had lost, somewhere in the last 40 seconds, the specific quality of absolute certainty it had carried when he walked through the door. You have an interest, he said, in characterizing last night as you describe it. That interest is self-evident. Yes, she said. And you have an interest in characterizing 2 years of documented conspiracy as unauthorized intelligence operations. That interest is equally self-evident. She paused. The question for this room is not which of us has an interest. It's which of us has the evidence. He looked at Darius. Your Majesty, he said, your queen is an intelligent woman. She is also a woman who has spent 8 years building a private power structure inside this palace without your knowledge or sanction. I'm asking you, as your family, as someone who has served this throne for 40 years, to apply the law as it stands, not as she has chosen to reinterpret it. The room waited. It waited with the specific quality of a room that understood it was watching a thing that mattered. Not spectacle, not theater, but the actual machinery of a decision being made by a man who had the power to make it, in real time, in front of everyone. Darius looked at his uncle. He looked at the document on the floor. He looked at Serafina, and then he looked back at Cedric Vale with an expression she had not seen on his face in 8 years of marriage. Not the battlefield composure, not the administrative authority, not the private guilt she had watched him carry through 3 weeks of silence. Something older than all of those. Something that had apparently been sitting behind all of them, waiting for the conditions under which it would become necessary. Where is Evelyn Hart? Darius said. Cedric Vale's composure held. That is not relevant to... I know it's not relevant to your document, Darius said. His voice was level and flat and had an edge in it that Serafina had heard once before. On the 3rd day of the Eastern Campaign, when a supply commander had tried to reclassify a logistics failure as a strategic decision, and Darius had ended the man's career in 11 words. I'm not asking about the document. I'm asking where Evelyn Hart is, because she was in this palace last night under the Queen's protection, and 2 men you sent through a passage in the east wall put hands on her. Cedric Vale did not answer. Captain Voss, Darius said. Voss appeared at the antechamber door. Evelyn Hart came through behind her. She was not dressed formally. She was in the plain clothes Cressida had brought her, her dark hair loose, her face carrying the specific composed exhaustion of someone running on 3 hours of interrupted sleep and the residual cost of genuine fear. She stopped at the threshold and looked at the room, at the assembled court, at Cedric Vale standing at its center, at Serafina and Darius on the open floor. Her hand was at her stomach. Still. Always. Cedric Vale looked at her. And for the first time since he had walked through the east gate, Serafina watched something in his composure develop a crack. Not a break, not a collapse, but the specific fracture line that appears when a man who has spent 2 years treating a human being as a variable in a calculation is confronted with that human being standing upright and present and real in a room full of witnesses. He had not planned for her in this room. He had planned for her as a leverage point, as a thing that could be used, as the physical evidence of the king's weakness that could be parlayed into constitutional crisis. He had not planned for the specific quality of what it looked like when she walked through a door. "Lord Cedric Vale," Darius said. Cedric turned back to the king. "You are being detained," Darius said, "on grounds of armed intrusion into the royal residential suite, conspiracy against the crown's household, and the unlawful direction of military assets on Imperial Road without authorization." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "These are not constitutional matters subject to council review. They are criminal matters subject to the crown's direct authority." For 2 full seconds, Cedric Vale stood in the center of the throne room floor and said nothing. Then he looked at Seraphina. It was a long look, the kind that carries the full weight of a long history between two people. Not warmth, not its absence, but the specific quality of two minds that have been measuring each other for years, finally standing in the same room with nothing left between them and the accounting. "You should have broken," he said. "Yes," she said. "You built for that. I gave you every reason." "You did." She held his gaze. "That was your mistake. Men who give you every reason to break are also giving you every reason to know exactly what they need from you. And what they need from you is the one thing you can choose not to give." His eyes stayed on her for another second. Then he looked away. The guards moved. What followed happened fast. Not the clean procedural motion of a planned arrest, but the specific compressed chaos of a man with 2 guards of his own who had not been told what to do when the operation's central assumption failed. One of Vale's men stepped forward. A guard's hand went to a weapon. Darius's voice cut across the room, a single word, sharp as a dropped blade. And the throne room held on the edge of the thing for 4 full seconds before Vale's man stood down. Before he stood down, in those 4 seconds, Seraphina drew the ceremonial blade at her hip. She had worn it every formal occasion for 3 years. She had practiced with it for 2 more years before that. It was not a fighting weapon. It was too short and too narrow for serious close-quarters work. But it was drawn, and in her hand, and she was standing between Evelyn Hart and the forward movement of 2 armed men, and what it communicated was not technical combat capability. It communicated that she had already decided. The guards completed the arrest. Vale's men were disarmed and detained. Vale himself submitted with the specific dignity of a man who had prepared, somewhere in his planning, for this exact outcome as a contingency, which told her more than the last hour of confrontation had. A man who prepares for capture is a man who has already moved his most important assets somewhere the capture can't reach. The nephew, the properties, the charitable instrument. She thought, this is not over. She thought it was never going to end in one room. She was still holding the blade when Heron came through the south entrance. He came in with 4 of his own men and stopped in the doorway, reading the room in the 2 seconds a good general uses to read terrain, and his face went through the specific sequence of a man finding the ground where he expected solid footing, and finding instead the thing had already shifted under him. He looked at the guards holding Cedric Vale. He looked at Seraphina. She looked at him. "General?" she said. He said nothing. "I need you to make a decision," she said. "Right now, in this room, in front of everyone in it." He looked at Vale, at the guards, at the document still on the floor between them. He looked at Evelyn Hart standing at the antechamber threshold, with her hand at her stomach and her eyes on the room, with the direct, careful quality that Seraphina had noted from the very beginning, the quality that refused to go entirely away no matter how much pressure came at it. He looked, last, at Darius. Darius looked back at him with the face he wore on the 3rd day of the Eastern campaign. Heron's jaw moved once. Then his 4 men stepped to either side, and he walked forward into the room, and stopped, and placed his hand against his chest in the formal military salute that a general gives the crown and gives no one else. He looked at Seraphina. "What do you need, Your Majesty?" he said. The room exhaled. Not all of it. Not Cedric Vale, who was being held at the room's far edge, and whose face had gone to the particular controlled stillness of a man storing everything he was seeing for future use. Not the 3 foreign dignitaries who were watching with the alert neutrality of people who understood they were seeing something worth reporting home. Not the 2 men who had come in with Vale and were now secured and silent against the east wall, but the room, the bulk of it, the court members and the guards, and the staff at the periphery, exhaled with the specific quality of a crowd that has been holding something back for a long time. Seraphina lowered the blade. She looked at Cedric Vale across the length of the throne room. He was still watching her, In his eyes, behind the controlled stillness, she saw the specific expression she had been waiting for. Not defeat, because this man did not process defeat the way others did, but the particular recalibration of a very patient man who had just realized that the game had changed its shape and that the next move was going to require something he had not yet used. She knew what it was. She had known since the charitable instrument, since the nephew on the Eastern Garrison Road, already gone before dawn, since the documents that were not in the vault because he had never needed the vault. The most important piece was not here. It was already in motion, and she had exactly one advantage left. She knew what it was, and he did not know she knew. She looked at Darius. "Hold him," she said. "Don't let him speak to anyone. Not his men, not his staff, not a courier. No communication leaves this room in his name." "For how long?" Darius said. She was already moving toward the south exit. "Until I get back," she said. "Where are you going?" She paused at the door. She thought about the nephew, the Eastern Garrison, the road south from the capital that connected to the Vale family's oldest property, the one that had not been transferred, not been moved, not appeared in any of the asset documentation she had reviewed, the one that predated the Empire's current titling system, the one whose existence was not in any record she had access to because it had been registered before the registry existed, the one her mother had mentioned once, in passing, when Serafina was 11 years old and learning to read the faces of men who smiled too wide. Her mother, who had grown up in the Vale household, who had known Cedric Vale's architecture longer than anyone, who had written letters. She had kept them, all of them, in the back of the writing desk, behind the map with the question in the margin, that Serafina had read and reread so many times she had stopped seeing the words and started seeing the structure behind them. Her mother had written, "He keeps the thing that matters most in the place he built first." She had thought that was poetry. It was coordinates. "South Road," she said, 12 miles. She went through the door. Behind her, Cedric Vale's voice came across the throne room, controlled, precise, with the specific quality of a man playing his last card before the hand closes. "Serafina." She stopped, did not turn. "The boy," he said. "Aldrich. He has the original documentation, every letter you wrote under seal, every communication you sent without council authorization. He has it all." A pause. "And he has orders that if I don't send a specific courier by midday..." She turned. Cedric Vale looked at her from across the throne room with the expression she had last seen on his face when she was 11 years old, and he had looked at her across her father's dinner table with the specific assessment of a man deciding whether a child was a variable or a threat. He had decided then. He was deciding now. "He burns it," Vale said, "all of it. And without your documentation, the only record that exists of what you've been building in this palace is the one Galloway produces." The room was completely silent. He had played it. 20 years of patience, 2 years of active construction, a night of failed operations. And this was what was underneath all of it. Not the passage, not Heron, not the council testimony, a young man on the South Road with a fire kit and a box of letters. The kind of threat that had no legal counter, no evidentiary response. The kind that worked precisely because it was irreversible. She looked at Cedric Vale. He looked at her. She thought, there is no map for this. She thought, good. The blade was still in her hand. She was standing in the doorway of the throne room with the South Road 12 miles behind her, and a midday deadline and the full weight of 2 years of careful architecture balanced on a decision she had maybe 30 seconds to make before the window closed. And she realized, with the specific cold clarity of someone who has just seen the actual shape of a thing for the first time, that Cedric Vale had made the same mistake in the end that every careful man makes when he runs out of careful options. He had told her where the boy was. She told him where the boy was. Not to the room. To Darius, low and direct, 2 words and a road marker that she had pulled from a letter written in her mother's hand 20 years ago, and stored in the part of her memory she reserved for things that had no immediate use but felt, in their bones, like they would. Darius looked at her for 1 second. Then he looked at General Reyes, who had come in through the south entrance 20 minutes ago and had been standing at the room's edge with the specific alert stillness of a man who had not yet been given an order but understood one was coming. "South Road," Darius said. 12 miles. Move fast and move quiet." Reyes was already turning. Cedric Vale watched this exchange from across the throne room with the expression of a man recalculating a sequence he had believed was closed. His eyes moved from Darius to Seraphina and back, and she watched him work through it, watched the specific process of a very intelligent man, understanding that the information he had just used as a threat had simultaneously given her the location of the one piece she hadn't had. He had told her where the boy was. "You don't know the property," he said. "My mother grew up in your household," she said. "She wrote me letters. She had a particular memory for places that mattered." She held his gaze. "The first property. The one your grandfather built before the registry existed. She called it the stone house at the river bend." The composure held. But something behind his eyes went very still in the way that stillness goes when a man arrives at the specific recognition that the architecture he built over 20 years has a single point. He left undefended because he could not imagine anyone knowing it existed. He said nothing. That was confirmation enough. She looked at Darius. He nodded once. The order was already moving down the south road with Reyes and 6 riders, and the specific urgency of a deadline that had maybe 3 hours left on it. She put the blade back at her hip. The throne room held its breath. She looked at Cedric Vale, her mother's brother, the man who had sat across from her at her father's table when she was 11 years old, and decided she was a threat before she had done anything to earn the assessment. And she felt, for the first time since the gate opened below her apartments the previous night, the specific weight of everything the last 8 hours had cost settling into her body. Not the strategic cost. The other kind. The kind that doesn't come due during the crisis because the crisis keeps it deferred, and arrives afterward with the accumulated interest of everything you didn't let yourself feel while the work was happening. She had loved this man once. She had been 11. He had a particular laugh. She had not heard it in a long time. She looked at him now and understood something she had been circling for years without landing on, that the specific shape of his ambition was not the hunger for power that court gossips attributed to ambitious men. It was older than that and quieter. It was the particular fear of a man who had spent 40 years watching power move around him and never fully through him, who had served 3 kings with absolute competence and been essential to all of them and been none of them, who had looked at a 14-year-old girl arriving at court and seen, in her eyes, the specific quality of perception that would eventually see through everything he'd built. He had not moved against her out of cruelty. He had moved against her out of the oldest and most corrosive kind of terror, the terror of being finally, completely known. She did not say this. It was not a thing that needed to be said. Understanding the architecture of a man's damage does not change what the damage built, and what it built had put 2 armed men in a room with a pregnant woman in the dark. The understanding lived separately from the accounting. Both were real. "Lord Vale," she said. He looked at her. "You're going to be tried," she said. "Formally, with counsel, with the full process of imperial law. You will have the opportunity to present everything you have. The testimony, the council's signatures, Heron's account, all of it. You will be heard." She paused. "I want you to understand that the process will be complete and that I will not interfere with it." He looked at her with the iron-gray eyes that had been measuring her for half her life. "That is not mercy," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. Mercy would be simpler." She stepped back. The guards moved him toward the holding chambers. His 2 men followed, secured, and the room began its gradual release of pressure, the specific slow exhale of a crowd that has been holding itself rigid for an extended period and is only now remembering that its component parts have individual bodies with individual requirements. Seraphina stood on the throne room floor and let it settle around her. Heron came to stand beside her. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the door through which Vale had been taken, with the expression of a man doing a private accounting that he was not yet ready to share. "He came to me 4 years ago," Heron said, "not with threats, with reasons." He was quiet for a moment. He was very good at reasons. "Yes," she said. "He was. The boy. Aldrich. I put him in the garrison because Cedric asked me to. I told myself it was a favor, not a commitment." He stopped. "I was wrong about the difference." She looked at him sidelong. He was 61 years old and had the face of a man who had spent 4 decades making decisions under pressure, and was only now, in the specific quiet after the crisis had resolved, confronting the one he had gotten wrong in a way that couldn't be reclassified. "You came back," she said. "I almost didn't," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. The almost is the part that matters. He looked at her then. Something in his face that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but contained the specific quality of a man who has been given, unexpectedly, more room than he believed he had earned. What happens now? He said. You submit a full written account of every contact with Vale's operation, every conversation, every instruction, every name, complete and unredacted. She looked at him steadily. Then we decide what the account means for what comes after. He nodded. He moved away through the thinning crowd, and she watched him go and thought about the specific way that loyalty fractures, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow accumulation of small decisions that each seem individually manageable until the aggregate reveals a shape that can no longer be called by its original name. Heron had not decided to betray her. He had decided, 4 years ago, to do a favor, and then another. And then the favors had become a position, and the position had become a wall. And by the time he understood the shape of the wall, he was already on the wrong side of it. She did not know yet what the account would mean for what came after. She knew it would be complicated and honest, and that it would require her to hold two things simultaneously: the fact of what he had done, and the fact of the moment in the throne room when he had made his choice. Both true. Neither canceling the other. That was what the aftermath always required. Darius found her an hour later in the outer garden, the small one off the east wing, the one she had claimed in the second year of their marriage because it had a stone bench that caught the afternoon sun, and because nobody used it in the morning, and because she had needed, in those early years, a single place in the palace that was not watching her back. He sat beside her on the bench without being invited, which was something he had learned to do by the 5th year. She had taught him, without meaning to, that waiting for permission in spaces that belonged to her was a form of distance she didn't want from him specifically. They sat for a while without speaking. The garden held the specific quality of a warm morning after a cold night, the stone of the bench still carrying last night's chill under the current warmth of the sun, the air having that clean quality that comes after tension breaks, and a space is allowed to be simply itself again. Reyes got him, Darius said. Aldrich Vale, South Road, 9 miles. He hadn't reached the property yet. The documents? Intact. He had them in a saddlebag. He paused. He's 23. Genuinely didn't understand the full shape of what he was carrying. Cedric told him it was insurance. It was, she said. He's frightened. He should be, but he's not the architect. She looked at the garden wall. Old stone, older than the palace's current structure, remnant of something that had stood here before the Empire built over it. He's a young man who was given a task by someone he trusted and told it was important. That's a different accounting than Cedric's. Darius was quiet for a moment. You're going to let him go, he said. I'm going to decide what he actually knew and respond to that specifically. She looked at the sun on the wall. Which is not the same thing. He looked at her profile. She could feel the quality of his attention, the specific way he looked at her when he was trying to hold all of what she was at once, rather than the portion currently visible. He had looked at her like that on the 3rd day of the first Eastern campaign, when she had walked into his command tent with a logistics analysis that rerouted his supply line and saved the flank he was about to lose. He had looked at her like a man confronting a fact about himself, that he had been standing next to something significant and had not been looking at it directly. 8 years, he said. Yes. I owe you. Don't count it, she said. Serafina, don't count it, she said again, and her voice was not unkind. It had the specific quality of a woman who had already done this accounting herself and knew what the numbers produced, and had decided that the production of the numbers was not the point. I didn't build what I built because you owed me. I built it because the Empire needed it built, and I was the person who could build it. She paused. Some of that was love. Some of it was stubbornness. Most of it was that I had been watching these people for 8 years, and I could see exactly what they were going to do, and I could not watch it happen without doing something about it. I was quiet. It's not how a marriage is supposed to work, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. The sun had moved far enough to warm the bench's surface fully, and the garden was doing its morning work. The specific small industry of light and air that goes on regardless of what happens in the rooms around it. There was a bird somewhere in the east wall's ivy. There was the distant sound of the garrison changing its rotation. There was the ordinary persistence of a world continuing to be itself. I am sorry, Darius said. For Evelyn. For the circumstances that were used. He stopped. Started again with the specific effort of a man who has prepared this and is finding that the prepared version is not adequate. I should have, you should have, she said. Yes, I know that's insufficient. It is. She looked at him. And it's also where we start from. Insufficient and true is a better foundation than sufficient and false. She held his gaze. I have not been entirely honest with you either. The operational secrecy had its practical justifications, and they were real. But some portion of it was also that I did not trust you with what I was actually doing, and that was its own kind of distance. She paused. That was its own kind of wrong. He looked at her for a long time. Where do we go from here, he said. She thought about this. Not the political answer, the infrastructure of the post-trial period, the reconstruction of the council, the formal proceedings against Vale and his faction, the careful management of the allied lords, who would need to be assessed and repositioned and in some cases removed. All of that was real and would take years, and she had already begun the first section of the working plan in her head on the walk from the throne room to this bench. She thought about the other answer. Forward, she said, with less distance than we've been keeping. He nodded. It was not a resolution in the dramatic sense, not the specific shape of two people arriving at perfect understanding and completing each other's sentences and moving in synchronized harmony. It was the quieter thing, the more durable thing, the specific small decision to stay in the same direction as another person and to be honest about what the walking costs. She had spent 8 years building a structure to protect an empire. Some of what she had protected it from had been external. Some of it had been the specific fragility of two people who had been operating in parallel rather than together for long enough that the parallel had started to look like the whole picture. That was also a thing that needed to be named and then worked on. She stood up. Evelyn Hart was in the East Wing receiving room when Serafina arrived. She was sitting at the window with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking out at the grounds with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone whose situation has shifted so dramatically in such a short span that the mind is still running its accounting on whether the shift is real. She looked up when Serafina came in. The man, she said, the one who... Cedric Vale. Is it... It's done, Serafina said. He's being held. Evelyn's breath came out. Not a sob, not relief in the performed sense, but the specific physical release of a person who has been carrying a weight for long enough that its absence is almost disorienting. Her hand went to her stomach. Always. Serafina sat across from her. I need to tell you what comes next, she said, so you can make a clear decision about it. Evelyn looked at her. The child, Serafina said, is the king's. That is a fact that will not change, and that the empire will need to absorb. The way it absorbs it will depend in part on how it is handled. She held Evelyn's eyes. You are not required to remain in this palace. You are not required to be part of the court's formal life. If you want to take your child and your family and live outside the palace walls with a crown settlement that guarantees your security for life, that is a real option, and I will make it happen. Evelyn was watching her carefully. And if I stay, she said, then the child is acknowledged, raised with appropriate position, and you are given a role in the household that reflects your dignity and not your original position. Serafina paused. Neither option is simple. Both are real. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. You could have chosen differently, she said. Last night, when the physician said whose child it was, you could have... Yes, Serafina said. I could have. Why didn't you? Serafina looked at the window. At the same ground she had looked at from her own window 12 hours ago. The same stone walls, the same eastern plain beyond them. The same light doing its work on surfaces that didn't ask whether they deserved it. Because what you were carrying had nothing to do with what was done to you, she said. And because I had watched powerful people use small people as instruments for long enough that the moment I saw a choice to do something different, I could not make any other one. She paused. That is probably not a sufficient explanation. It's enough, Evelyn said. She looked down at her cup. I want to go, she said. Not because I'm afraid. Because I never wanted any of this. The palace, the court, all of it. I wanted to be somewhere quiet with my child and my mother, and enough to live on without someone using me for something. Then that's what you'll have, Serafina said. The child will know, Evelyn said. Not a question. The child will know what the child is, Serafina said. How that knowledge is held. What it means to him. What shape it takes in his life. that will be his to decide when he's old enough to decide it. She looked at Evelyn. He won't be a scandal. He won't be a secret. He'll be a person with a complicated beginning and enough resources to become something that isn't defined by it. Evelyn's eyes were steady. Thank you, she said. Serafina stood. Thank me in a year, she said. When the proceedings are over and the court has moved on, and quiet is actually what you have. She left the room. The proceedings against Cedric Vale lasted 3 months. They were formal, complete, and conducted with the specific rigor of a process that could not afford to be questioned in its execution, even when its outcome was not in doubt. Vale's counsel was thorough, and his defense was as good as the evidence allowed, which was not good enough. Heron's written account, 11 pages, unredacted, covering 4 years of contact with the Vale operation, corroborated the physical evidence from the passage. The 3 council members whose signatures appeared on the testimony document were investigated separately, and 2 of them were removed from their positions before the proceedings concluded. Fenwick resigned. Galloway produced a formal apology and 3 years of misdirected administrative decisions that took the Crown's accounting office the better part of 6 months to unravel. Lady Ruelle, whose name had been on 2 documents, and whose actual participation in the operation was the most marginal of the 3, cooperated fully and was permitted to retain her title under a formal censure that she accepted without contest. Serafina had made a specific decision about Ruelle, that the woman's culpability was real, but her value as a cooperative witness in the proceedings outweighed the satisfaction of a fuller punishment. She had made that decision with her eyes open and without needing it to feel like mercy. It was strategy. Strategy was not unkind for being strategy. Aldrich Vale, the nephew, the young man on the South Road who had carried a saddlebag he hadn't fully understood, was given a reduced censure after his complete cooperation and a formal 2-year suspension from any imperial appointment. He was 23. He had been used by someone he trusted. Those were facts. So was the fact that he had accepted the task without asking the questions that would have revealed its nature. Both facts were part of the accounting. Cedric Vale was stripped of his title, his properties, including the stone house at the river bend, which turned out to be exactly where her mother's letter had said it was, on a property that predated the registry and had been in the Vale family for 6 generations, and his standing in the imperial court. He was exiled to the Eastern Territories rather than executed, which was a decision Serafina had argued for on grounds that were both practical and something she did not spend much time naming. I was 71 years old. He had known her since before she had known herself. The exile was not mercy. It was the specific choice of a woman who had understood, sitting on the garden bench that morning after the crisis resolved, that what she did with the power she had earned mattered as much as how she had earned it. That the measure of a person who had been through the fire was not what the fire had burned away, but what it had revealed underneath. She had looked at Cedric Vale across the proceeding chamber on the day the sentence was delivered, and she had felt the full weight of everything she knew about him. The laugh she had liked when she was 11, the way he had looked at her father's dinner table, the 20 years of patient construction, the 2 armed men in the dark, the pregnant girl against a wall, and she had held all of it without letting any single piece of it determine the decision. That was the hardest thing. Not the intelligence work, not the 2 years of careful building, not the night of the passage, and the throne room and the South Road. The hardest thing was standing at the end of all of it, with the power to be cruel and choosing something else. Not because cruelty was beneath her, but because cruelty was the thing that would have finished what Cedric Vale had started. He had tried to make her into something bitter and reactive and small. The exile was her refusal. Complete, formal, and final. He did not speak to her on the day of sentencing. She did not speak to him. There was nothing left to say that the proceedings had not already said more precisely. He left the capital on a gray morning in early autumn, in a plain carriage with 2 household staff who had volunteered to accompany him, and Serafina watched him go from the upper window of the east wing, not with satisfaction, not with grief, but with the specific quiet of a person watching a long chapter conclude and understanding that the conclusion does not erase the chapter but does, finally, end it. The empire continued. It continued the way empires continue, not cleanly, not without friction, not with the specific narrative satisfaction of a thing resolved and permanently settled. The council was rebuilt over the course of a year, with appointments that Serafina and Darius made together. with the kind of transparent process that she had argued for, and he had come to understand was not idealism, but the specific pragmatism of an empire that needed its own people to believe in its machinery. They worked better together than they had worked in parallel, not perfectly, not without conflict. There were 3 arguments in the first 6 months that required a full day of separate thinking before either of them was willing to come back to the table. But the arguments were honest, and the distance between them was smaller than it had been. And the specific quality of working alongside someone who knew the full shape of what you were and had decided to stay in the same direction was something that accumulated differently than the careful parallel distance they had maintained for years. She did not forgive him quickly. He did not ask her to. What they built instead was slower and less elegant and considerably more durable, the specific structure of 2 people who had failed each other in measurable ways, choosing, with clear eyes, to continue. She had spent enough years watching the architecture of power to know that this too was a kind of structure, and that its integrity depended on the honesty of its foundation rather than the smoothness of its surface. Some mornings it was enough. Some mornings it was simply what they had, which was a different thing and equally real. Evelyn Hart left the capital before the winter. She went with her mother and her brother to a property in the northern valley, crown-settled, modest, with enough land to be self-sufficient, and enough distance from the court's memory to become simply a life rather than a circumstance. Before she left, she came to the East Wing in the late afternoon with the specific quality of someone who has prepared what they want to say and is finding, in the moment of saying it, that the prepared version is inadequate. She stood in the doorway and looked at Serafina. "I keep trying to find the right thing," she said. "There isn't one," Serafina said. "You went through something that required you to survive it, and you did. The rest is just what comes after." Evelyn's hand was at her stomach. The child was moving now. She had told Serafina this 2 weeks ago, with the specific mixture of wonder and terror that belongs to a person confronting something real for the first time. Serafina had listened and had said nothing about what she knew of wonder and terror, which was considerable and had been hard-won, because some knowledge is not useful to transfer and some moments belong entirely to the person living them. "I'll send word when he's born," Evelyn said. "I'd like that," Serafina said. Evelyn nodded. She left. Serafina stood at the window of the East Wing and watched the carriage move through the outer gate and onto the road north, and she held what she felt about it. The specific layered quality of an emotion that contained satisfaction and grief, and something that was not quite hope but functioned like it. The feeling of watching something that had been in danger of becoming a tragedy choose, instead, to become a life. That was not nothing. In the years that followed, people talked about the night of the banquet the way people talk about events that have changed the shape of things, with the specific reverence of stories that have been told enough times to develop their own weight. They talked about what the Queen had said, and how the court had fallen to its knees, and what it meant about the nature of power in the Alpha Empire going forward. Most of what they said was incomplete. They talked about the moment in the hall. They rarely talked about the hours that followed, the passage in the wall, the cold vault, the garden bench, the 3 months of proceedings, the autumn morning when a plain carriage left the Capitol gate. Those parts were less dramatic and more true, and truth in its working form rarely produces the kind of clean image that stories want. Serafina did not correct the stories. She had spent enough years understanding that the version of a thing that travels through a court is not the same as the version that happened, and that what mattered was not the story's accuracy, but its effect. And the effect of this particular story, imprecise as it was that a certain kind of behavior became measurably more dangerous to attempt in the Alpha Empire for the better part of a generation. That was sufficient. On a morning in the spring following the proceedings' conclusion, she sat at the garden bench where she had sat with Darius the morning after the crisis, and she read the letter that had arrived from the Northern Valley. Brief, in Evelyn's straightforward hand. The child had been born, a boy, as the physician had predicted. Healthy. Loud, Evelyn noted, with what Serafina could read as the specific wry observation of a woman who had not anticipated the particular quality of loud that a healthy infant produces at close range. He had dark hair. He looked, Evelyn wrote, and then crossed out a word and wrote it again. He looked like someone who had already decided to be here. Serafina sat with the letter for a long time. The sun was warm on the stone bench. The ivy on the east wall was making its spring advance. Somewhere in the palace, the business of an empire was proceeding. The council meeting, the administrative review, the 6 open appointments she had been working through with Darius for the last 3 weeks. She held the letter. She thought about this first night, about the hall full of kneeling people, about the specific clarity of standing at the high table and saying the thing that needed to be said without the comfort of knowing how it would land. She had not known, in that moment, how it would land. She had known only what she would not be. Not the version of herself that broke on schedule, not the instrument of someone else's ending, not the woman who let a pregnant girl take the fall for a conspiracy, built by men who counted on the cleanness of their own distance. That was all she had known. Everything else had been built in the hours and months and years that followed, from the wreckage of the things that hadn't held and the foundation of the things that had, with the specific patient labor of someone who had decided a long time ago that the work of being present in her own life was worth doing even when the cost was high and the outcome was not guaranteed. The outcome was never guaranteed. That was not a comfortable thing, and it was also not a tragedy. It was the condition of being awake in the world, the specific price and the specific gift of choosing to see clearly and act on what you saw and live with the full weight of what that cost. And to find at the end of it that the weight was not what destroyed you, it was what proved you were there. She folded the letter. She put it in the inner pocket of her dress, next to the old map with the question in the margin that she still carried, that she would probably always carry, because there was something in the incompleteness of it that she had stopped trying to resolve and started using as a reminder, that the questions you can't yet answer are not the evidence of failure. They are the shape of what you are still capable of learning. She stood up from the bench. She went inside. The Empire was waiting, and she had work to do, and it was enough. Not perfect, not finished, but alive and present, and hers in the specific way that things become yours when you have chosen them with full knowledge of their cost. It was more than enough. It was everything.